Adrian Mercer signed the last page with a smirk that didn't belong on a man sitting in a lawyer's office. It belonged on someone who had already won and knew it. He capped his pen, leaned back in his chair, and looked across the table at the woman he was discarding after 11 years of marriage. "You took the shell company," he said. "Constellation Holdings." He let out a short laugh, not cruel, just dismissive, which was somehow worse. "Naomi, that thing hasn't filed a real asset in 4 years. It's a tax ghost." Naomi Blake didn't look up from the document she was signing. She turned the page, signed again. "I know what it is," she said quietly. Adrian glanced at his attorney, sharing the kind of look men share when they believe a woman has just made a foolish decision and is too proud to admit it. His attorney gave a small shrug, a gesture that said, "Let her have it." "Okay." Adrian stood, buttoned his jacket. "My people will process the transfer by end of week. Good luck, Naomi. I mean that." She finally looked up. Her eyes were steady, not angry, not sad, just clear. "Thank you, Adrian," she said. "I think you're going to need it more than I do." He laughed again, louder this time. Then he walked out. He would spend the next 72 hours celebrating. He would never celebrate anything again. If this story is already pulling you in, stay until the very end. Because what Naomi does next will change everything you think you know about power. Hit the like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The offices of Hargrove and Lind occupied the 41st floor of a glass tower on Park Avenue, the kind of building where the elevators moved silently and the carpet swallowed the sound of your footsteps. It was a place designed to make everything feel final. Decisions made here tended to stay made. Naomi Blake had been inside these offices 3 times in the past 4 months. Each visit had taken something from her. The first time, she'd walked out understanding that she was not going to receive what she'd asked for: the family home in Greenwich, the joint investment accounts, the small equity stake in Mercer Global Logistics that she'd quietly helped build over nearly a decade of late nights and unreimbursed work. The second time, she'd walked out with a counteroffer that was half of the first offer and wrapped in language that made her feel like a liability being settled. The third time, today, she had walked in knowing exactly what she intended to leave with. It wasn't what anyone in that room expected. She was 43 years old. She had spent 11 years married to one of the most recognized names in American business. She had a graduate degree in information systems that she had used exactly twice in her marriage. Once when Adrian needed someone to quietly audit a vendor contract he suspected was fraudulent, and once when Mercer Global's internal tech team had stalled out on a project that was burning through capital faster than it produced results. Both times, she had fixed the problem. Both times, Adrian had thanked her privately and then moved on as if it hadn't happened, the way people move on from things that don't fit the story they're already telling about themselves. Naomi had stopped expecting credit years ago. Credit wasn't the point anymore. She wore a charcoal blazer over a white blouse, simple jewelry, low heels. She had not tried to look powerful. She had tried to look forgettable, which was a different thing entirely and, in her experience, considerably more useful. Her attorney was a woman named Claudia Reeves. Mid-50s, brisk, with the kind of no-nonsense manner that came from 20 years of watching wealthy men assume they were the smartest person in the room. Claudia had reviewed the full settlement proposal twice before recommending Naomi accept it. Then Naomi had walked her through what she'd found buried in the asset disclosure schedules, and Claudia had gone quiet in the way lawyers go quiet when they realize the ground just shifted. "You're certain," Claudia had said 3 days before the signing. "I've verified it 4 different ways," Naomi told her. "The software is legally held by the shell. It's been there for 2 years. And he doesn't know. His CFO knew. His CFO restructured the asset placement to reduce tax exposure on the tech division. The restructuring was legally clean, but whoever set it up didn't think through what it meant if the shell ever changed hands." Claudia had been quiet for a long moment. "Because it means the shell owner controls the software." "The shell owner," Naomi said, "controls the software." 10. The conference room was long and rectangular, with a view of Midtown that would have been impressive if anyone in the room had been looking at it. Nobody was. There were 6 people at the table: Adrian and his 2 attorneys on one side, Naomi and Claudia on the other, and a mediator at the head of the table who was being paid an hourly rate that probably exceeded Naomi's first job salary. Adrian Mercer was 51 years old and had the kind of appearance that reads differently in different contexts. In a magazine profile, he was described as magnetic, forceful, self-made. In a room like this, where he sat with his arms crossed and his jaw set, he looked like a man who was accustomed to winning arguments by outlasting the other person's patience. He was fit in that deliberate, maintained way of men who have personal trainers and think about their calorie intake. He kept his hair shorter than he used to. His watch was visible on purpose. It was the kind of watch that communicated a number without stating it. Naomi had bought him that watch for his 47th birthday, which he had celebrated in the Maldives with a woman she hadn't known about yet. She didn't think about that now. She hadn't thought about it in months, which had surprised her at first, and then stopped surprising her. Grief had its own timeline, and hers had apparently been shorter than she expected, maybe because she'd spent so many years grieving the marriage quietly while she was still inside it. The signing took 40 minutes. Most of it was unremarkable. Assets were itemized, assigned, initialed. Adrian received the Greenwich house, the Tribeca penthouse, and a car collection that he had spent 16 years accumulating. He received the liquid investment accounts. He received his equity in Mercer Global Logistics, the company that had made him, by most estimates, somewhere between $3 and $4 billion. He received the boat. He received the things that looked like the things. Naomi received the Greenwich bank account with a balance under $200,000, negotiated down from 3 times that. She received some jewelry. She received a cash settlement that her attorney had publicly protested but privately told her was acceptable, given what they knew. And she received Constellation Holdings, LLC, a Delaware-registered shell company with no employees, no active operations, no recent filings of any significance, and an asset ledger that listed a single item under intellectual property holdings in language so technical and opaque that Adrian's legal team had apparently never flagged it. When the transfer of Constellation came up in the documents, Adrian's lead attorney, a man named Barrett, who wore pocket squares and had gone to Yale twice, made a small note on his legal pad. Adrian leaned over, glanced at it, and then looked at Naomi with something that was one step below contempt. "You want Constellation?" he said. It wasn't a question. "It's in my requests," Naomi said. "I know it's in your requests. I'm asking if you actually want it." He paused. "Naomi, that company is a ghost. You know that, right? There's nothing there." "Then you won't mind giving it to me," she said. He shrugged. "Be my guest." Barrett wrote something else on his pad. The mediator moved to the next page. Claudia had coached her on exactly how to behave when the documents were fully signed. "Don't smile," she'd said. "Don't say anything provocative. Let him have the room." Claudia was a practical woman who understood that the next several weeks were going to be complicated and that anything Naomi said today could become a problem later. Naomi had agreed. And she'd meant it when she agreed. She genuinely wasn't interested in the kind of moment that plays well in a movie but costs you in the aftermath. She wanted out cleanly. She wanted to be gone. But when Adrian stood, buttoned his jacket, and delivered his parting words with that particular quality of dismissal, that good luck, that tone, the tone of a man who is certain he has taken everything that matters. Something came up in her throat that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite satisfaction, but was somewhere between the two. And so she had said what she said, and he had laughed, and he had walked out. She sat for a moment after he was gone. The mediator was gathering papers. Barrett was already on his phone. Claudia sat beside her and said nothing, which was the correct thing to do. "That went well," Naomi finally said. Claudia picked up her pen. "Ask me again in 6 weeks. Tep." Naomi's apartment was a rental on the Upper West Side. 2 bedrooms, 1,200 square feet, the kind of place that cost more than it looked because of the neighborhood, and the year, and the city. She had moved in 3 months ago, when it became clear that the separation was permanent, and living in the Greenwich house was no longer something she could manage without feeling like she was waiting to be evicted from her own life. The apartment was sparse. She hadn't accumulated much. There was a reading chair she liked, a kitchen table she'd bought secondhand from a woman on Facebook Marketplace who was moving to Portland, and a desk in the second bedroom where she did most of her actual thinking. The walls were mostly bare. She had framed one photograph, not of her marriage, not of Adrian, but of herself at 31, standing in front of a server rack at a tech startup where she'd worked briefly before meeting Adrian, looking exhausted and satisfied in the way of someone who has just solved a problem that seemed unsolvable. She'd found the photo in a box during the move and couldn't explain exactly why she put it up. It had something to do with remembering that there had been a version of herself before the version she'd become. She sat at the kitchen table that evening with a glass of water, not wine. She'd mostly stopped drinking when the divorce proceedings started. It made her feel slow. And opened her laptop. There was an email from Claudia with several attachments. There was a message from her younger sister, Maya, who lived in Chicago and had been checking in with increasing frequency over the past 4 months, each message slightly more carefully worded than the last, as if Maya was afraid of saying the wrong thing. There was a newsletter she'd subscribed to about supply chain technology that she hadn't opened in 2 weeks. She didn't open any of them. Instead, she opened a folder she'd created 6 months ago, before she'd retained Claudia, before the formal separation, when she was still sleeping in the same house as Adrian and going to the same events, and smiling in photographs that now looked to her like documents of a very specific kind of loneliness. The folder was labeled Constellation Holdings, Internal Files. Inside it were 3 years of documentation, asset transfer records, corporate registration filings, software licensing agreements, correspondence between Mercer Global's CFO, a man named Roy Halliwell, and 2 different law firms, and at the center of it all, the software itself, or rather, the legal documentation establishing where the software lived. The software was called Nexus. Internally at Mercer Global, the tech team called it the backbone, because that was what it was. It was a proprietary logistics platform that managed routing, delivery scheduling, customs compliance, carrier allocation, and real-time inventory sync across Mercer Global's entire operation. The company had spent 7 years and somewhere north of $200 million building it. Without it, Mercer Global's global network, the thing that justified the company's valuation, and the thing that had made Adrian's investors very wealthy people, functioned at about 40% efficiency. Naomi had not built Nexus. She wanted to be clear about that in her own head, even if no one else ever knew the distinction. She had not written the code. She had not managed the development team. What she had done was the following. She had, in 2021, been present at a dinner party where Roy Halliwell had been drinking and had mentioned the asset restructuring he was planning for the tech division. She had asked clarifying questions, the way she always asked clarifying questions, not because she was plotting anything at that point, just because she was the kind of person who needed to understand things fully, who became uncomfortable around incomplete information. Roy had explained the structure. She had gone home and thought about it, and sometime in the weeks that followed, when her marriage was already in quiet freefall, and she was beginning to think about what the other side of it might look like, she had run the logic forward. If Constellation Holdings held Nexus, and after reviewing the corporate filings, she was certain that it legally did, then Constellation Holdings was not a shell company. It was a container. And what it contained was worth considerably more than anyone had told her. She closed the folder. Outside her window, the city made its usual sounds, traffic, voices, the distant horn of something large moving somewhere down the street. New York at night was never quiet, which she had come to appreciate because quiet made it easier to feel the shape of what was missing. She was not naive about what came next. She had spent 6 months preparing for it, and preparation didn't make it less frightening. It made it less surprising, which was different. There were people who would be very unhappy when they understood what had happened. Adrian would be unhappy. Roy Halliwell would be unhappy. The investors, chief among them a man named Victor Kane, who had backed Mercer Global through 2 major expansions and who had a reputation for responding to financial threats with something considerably more aggressive than lawyers. Victor Kane would be very unhappy indeed. She knew all of this. She had prepared for all of it, to the degree that any single person could prepare for the organized displeasure of extremely powerful men. She opened a new document and started drafting a letter. She sent it 11 days after the divorce was finalized. She gave Adrian's legal team and the Mercer Global board adequate notice because she was not interested in procedural vulnerabilities. She wanted everything she did to be so legally clean that there was no angle of attack available except on the merits. The letter was addressed to Adrian Mercer, CEO, Mercer Global Logistics, and copied to the company's general counsel, Roy Hallowell, and the board of directors. It was 4 pages long and had been reviewed by Claudia and 2 additional attorneys with specializations in intellectual property and corporate law. It stated plainly and without dramatic language that Naomi Blake, as the current sole owner of Constellation Holdings, LLC, was asserting ownership of the intellectual property asset held within that entity, specifically the Nexus Logistics platform, and was invoking her legal right to establish licensing terms for the technology's continued use by Mercer Global Logistics and its subsidiaries. The daily licensing fee she proposed was $1.4 million. Not annually, not monthly, daily. She included 17 pages of supporting documentation. She was in her kitchen making coffee the morning after the letter was delivered when her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. She let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again, and again. The 4th time she picked up. "What did you do?" Adrian's voice wasn't raised. It had the particular quality of a person who is trying very hard to maintain control of something that is rapidly becoming uncontrollable. "Naomi, what the hell did you do?" "I sent a letter," she said. She poured her coffee. We have used that platform." He stopped. She could hear him breathing. "Roy says it's wrong. He says the filing doesn't establish what you're claiming it establishes." "Roy can contact my attorney," she said. "Claudia Reeves. I'll send you her direct line." "Naomi." "Adrian." A long pause. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted. Some of the control had slipped, and underneath it was something rawer and less polished. "You planned this. Before the divorce. You already knew." "You signed the documents," she said. "You had 3 attorneys in that room. You knew what you were taking." She set her coffee mug down. "You told me it was trash," she said. "You told me it was a ghost. You told me good luck." She let a moment pass. "I think you meant it as an insult. I took it as advice." He said something she won't repeat here. Then he hung up. Naomi stood in her kitchen for a moment. Her hands were not shaking, which surprised her a little. She had thought they would. She'd been braced for the physical aftermath of confrontation, the adrenaline, the sick feeling, the second-guessing. Instead, there was something quieter, not triumph, more like the moment after a very long project when the last task has been completed and you're too tired for celebration, but too relieved for regret. She picked up her coffee. She drank it standing at the window, looking out at the gray October morning settling over the Upper West Side, and she let herself have 2 minutes of that feeling before she opened her laptop and started preparing for the next thing, because there was always a next thing, and the next thing was going to be complicated. She was right about that. Roy Hallowell contacted her attorney 3 days later with a legal challenge to her interpretation of the asset filing. The challenge was detailed and had clearly been put together quickly, which meant it had gaps. Claudia identified 4 of them in the first read-through. "They're going to push back hard," Claudia told her over the phone. "Barrett is already pulling together a case that the transfer was made in error, that the intent was never to include Nexus in the Constellation asset ledger." "Intent doesn't determine legal ownership," Naomi said. "No, it doesn't. But it muddies the water, and muddy water costs time and money to clear." "Let them muddy it," Naomi said. "I've got time." Claudia was quiet for a moment. "The board called my office this morning," she said. "One of the directors, a woman named Patricia Cho, she was very polite, asked if there was a conversation to be had." "There is," Naomi said. "The conversation is, here are the licensing terms." She implied they might approach the court for an emergency injunction to pause the licensing fee while the ownership question is litigated. Naomi had been expecting this. "Tell Patricia Cho that if they pursue an injunction and fail, which they will because the filing is clean, I'll revise the licensing terms upward." Another silence. "I'm going to pass that message along exactly as stated," Claudia said. "Just so you know what we're doing here." "I know what we're doing," Naomi said. Adrian did not contact her again directly for 11 days. She heard about him through Claudia, and once through a business journalist who called asking for comment on a story about disputed intellectual property claims between Mercer Global and a private holdings entity. Naomi declined comment politely twice. What she heard, filtered through attorneys and public reporting and the occasional text from someone who had worked at Mercer Global and still had her number from better years, was that the company was bleeding. The daily licensing fee was not something Mercer Global could simply refuse to pay and continue operations, because Naomi had anticipated that response and had structured the letter to include a provision. Failure to pay within 30 days of the invoice date triggered a formal licensing dispute that would place NextX in legal escrow pending resolution. Legal escrow meant no use by either party. Legal escrow meant Mercer Global's network ran on backup systems that could handle, at best, 60% of their usual volume. The investors were already making noise. Victor Kane had not called Naomi directly, not yet, but his name had appeared 3 times in conversations she wasn't supposed to know about, and each time it appeared, the sentence around it contained the word resolve. Victor Kane wanted this resolved. What that meant was not yet specific. She understood it would become specific soon. She spent those 11 days working, not on lawyers or documentation, Claudia had that handled, but on something else. Something she had started quietly, in the background, before the divorce was even finalized. A company. Not a shell. Not a container. Something real, built around Nexus but extending beyond it. Because Naomi was smart enough to know that her leverage was temporary. Nexus would eventually be resolved through litigation or acquisition or negotiation. The question was what she built with the time that resolution bought her. She was not going to spend it waiting. She had contacts in the logistics tech space, people she'd met through Adrian's world who had liked her more than they'd liked him, but had never said so out loud. She began calling them. She called carefully, and she listened more than she talked, and she took notes afterward that she stored in a folder on an encrypted drive that was not connected to any of her regular accounts. She was methodical about everything, not because she was afraid of being caught doing something wrong. She wasn't doing anything wrong. But because she had learned over 11 years of watching someone else operate at the top of a competitive industry that the difference between people who win and people who almost win is almost always documentation and preparation. Adrian was charismatic and decisive and good at the parts of business that happened in front of other people. He was not especially good at the parts that happened in spreadsheets and server rooms and contract annexes. He had always known this about himself, which was why he'd hired people to handle those parts. What he had never fully appreciated was that one of those people had been his wife. The first time Victor Kane's people made contact, it was not through an attorney. It was through a man who appeared outside Naomi's building at 7 in the morning as she was leaving for a meeting. Tall, wide, not in a suit, standing with the particular stillness of someone who has been told to stand there and wait. He didn't follow her. He didn't say anything threatening. He just looked at her in a way that was designed to communicate something without being legally actionable. Naomi looked back at him steadily, noted what he was wearing, what he looked like, what time it was, and what car was parked at the curb behind him with its engine running. Then she walked to the corner, flagged a cab, and called Claudia from the back seat. "I want it documented," she said. "Date, time, description, location, everything." "I'll file a report," Claudia said. "Don't file it yet," Naomi said. "Hold it. I want to have it ready, but I don't want to move it yet." "Naomi, I know," she said. "I know what it means. I'm not ignoring it. I just want to move carefully." Claudia said something that was the legal equivalent of "please be careful," phrased in professional language that didn't quite obscure the actual concern underneath. Naomi thanked her and hung up. She sat in the cab as it moved downtown through morning traffic and thought about the fact that she had known, intellectually, that this was possible. She had known that men like Victor Kane did not respond to financial threats the way ordinary people respond to financial threats, with calls and emails and negotiations. They responded with escalation in whatever form seemed most efficient. Knowing it intellectually and experiencing it as a large man standing in front of your building at 7 in the morning were 2 different things. She was not going to pretend otherwise. She was not the kind of person who mistook composure for fearlessness. She was afraid. She was managing it. That was the best she could do, and for the moment, it was enough. The day the first invoice came due, 30 days after the letter was sent, Mercer Global paid it. Not willingly. Claudia told her that Barrett had spent the final 3 days of the period attempting to negotiate a temporary suspension, a reduced rate, an installment arrangement. Each time, Claudia had responded pleasantly and referred him to the terms of the letter. On the 30th day, the payment came through. $1.4 million in full wire transfer, arriving in the Constellation Holdings account at 4:47 in the afternoon. Naomi was at her desk in the second bedroom when the alert came through on her phone. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put the phone down and went back to what she was working on. Maya called that evening. "How are you doing?" her sister asked, in the careful way she'd been asking. "I'm okay," Naomi said. "Just okay?" Naomi thought about the invoice, about the wire transfer, about the man outside her building, about Victor Kane's name in conversations she wasn't supposed to know about. She thought about Adrian's voice on the phone, that slipped quality, that moment when the controlled surface had cracked and something real and rattled had shown through. "Yeah," she said, "just okay. But it's a different kind of okay than it was 3 months ago." "What kind is it now?" Naomi looked at the photograph on her wall, herself at 31, standing in front of the server rack, exhausted and satisfied. "The kind where I know what I'm doing," she said. Maya was quiet for a beat. Then, "That sounds like a big deal." "It is," Naomi said. "It really is." She hung up shortly after that and made herself something to eat for the first time since breakfast, standing at the stove while the city outside did its ordinary evening things. Lights coming on in windows, the sound of someone's music drifting up from a lower floor, a cab horn somewhere on the street below. The second invoice was already drafted. It would go out in the morning. She was just getting started. The second invoice went out on a Tuesday morning, same terms as the first, $1.4 million, due in 30 days, with the same 17 pages of supporting documentation attached as a reminder that this was not a negotiating position, but a legal reality. Naomi sent it herself, through Claudia's office, at 8:15 in the morning. Then she made her second cup of coffee and went back to the spreadsheet she'd been building since 6 a.m. She didn't hear anything for 4 days. That silence was not reassuring. She had learned during 11 years adjacent to the way Adrian operated that silence from powerful men was rarely peaceful. It was preparatory. It meant they were talking to each other instead of to you, and what they were discussing was not whether to respond, but how. On the 5th day, Claudia called. "Barrett's filed a motion," she said. "They're going back to the original divorce proceedings, arguing that the inclusion of Constellation in the settlement was the result of incomplete disclosure on your part, that you had material knowledge of the asset's value and concealed it during negotiations." Naomi had been expecting this. She had a folder for it. "They're saying I committed fraud." They're saying it in the careful way lawyers say things when they're not quite sure it'll stick. The motion is a pressure tactic as much as anything. "What does it cost us?" "Time, money, attention." Claudia paused. "It also means the licensing fee is going to be contested while the motion is pending. They'll argue the ownership is under active dispute. And if a judge agrees to pause enforcement, then the daily fee stops until resolution. Could be 6 months, could be longer." Naomi turned her chair to face the window. The November sky outside was low and flat, the color of old dishwater. "Who's the judge on the motion?" Claudia told her. Naomi wrote the name down even though she didn't know anything about the judge yet. She would, by end of day. "File our opposition today," Naomi said. "I want it in before the week is out. And Claudia, I want it to be comprehensive, not just responsive. I want the history of the asset placement in that filing, Roy Hallowell's emails, the restructuring documents, everything that shows the placement was deliberate and documented and had nothing to do with me." "That's going to be expensive," Claudia said. "I know. The motion is probably going to trigger additional filings. This could go on for—" "I know," Naomi said again. "File it." There was a brief pause. "Okay," Claudia said. "I'll have a draft to you by Thursday." After she hung up, Naomi sat for a moment with the particular tiredness of someone who has already thought through the next 15 steps and is now beginning the first one. She was not unprepared for the litigation. She had money. Not Adrian's kind of money, not yet, but enough. She had documentation that was significantly cleaner than whatever Barrett's team was going to produce on short notice. And she had something else that she had been quietly assembling for the past 8 weeks, something that wasn't ready yet but was getting closer. She pulled up the spreadsheet, went back to work. The man outside her building appeared again on a Wednesday, 2 weeks after the first time. Different man, or the same build in different clothes, she couldn't be entirely certain. This time he was across the street, standing near a coffee cart, not looking at her door but positioned in a way that would make it easy to watch it. Naomi noticed him on her way out at 8:45. She noticed him still there when she returned at noon. She photographed him from her second-floor window with her phone, added it to the folder, called Claudia. "I think we need to talk about the surveillance question," Naomi said. "You think it's Kane's people." "I think the timing is not coincidental." Claudia was quiet for a moment. "I can reach out to a private security firm I've worked with before. They're discreet." "Do that," Naomi said. "I also want to talk about whether we accelerate the federal piece." Another pause. This one longer. They had discussed once, obliquely, the existence of what Naomi called the other material. Evidence that had nothing to do with Nexus or Constellation Holdings or the divorce. Evidence that concerned how Mercer Global Logistics had won 3 major federal contracts in the early years of the company's growth, and what had moved between certain accounts in the weeks before those contracts were awarded, and whose names appeared on the correspondence related to those movements. Naomi had not gone looking for this material. She had found it in 2020 when Adrian had asked her to help him locate a set of older financial files that had been improperly archived. She'd found the files. She'd also found other things stored in the same archive that she suspected were not supposed to be findable. She had copied them. She had not known at the time why she was doing it, only that something in her, some quiet, cautious instinct that had served her well in systems work, told her that information you found by accident was sometimes the most important kind. She had sat on it for 2 years. It felt, in those years, like carrying something heavy in a pocket, something you couldn't put down and couldn't talk about and couldn't entirely forget was there. "Not yet," Claudia said. "The federal piece is a significant escalation. Once we go there, we can't pull back." "I know. I want you to be sure." "I'm sure I'm not ready yet," Naomi said. "That's not the same as being unsure." Victor Kane called on a Thursday afternoon in late November. Not through attorneys, not through intermediaries. His actual number appeared on her screen, and she stared at it for 2 full rings before she picked up. "Miss Blake?" His voice was smooth in the way of someone who had spent decades deciding the tone of rooms. He was 64 years old. He had invested in 17 companies in the past 20 years and had been publicly wrong about one of them. He sat on 3 boards. He owned a home in the Hamptons, an apartment in London, and a ranch in Colorado. He had never been indicted for anything, which Naomi did not take to mean he had never done anything indictable. "Mr. Kane," she said. "I think we're overdue for a conversation," he said. "I hope you agree." "What kind of conversation?" "The honest kind," he said. "The kind where 2 intelligent people acknowledge that the current situation is costly for everyone and discuss whether there's a more efficient resolution." Naomi was at her kitchen table. She had not been expecting the call today, but she had been expecting it eventually, and she had prepared a version of this conversation in her head several times over the past weeks. She picked up her pen and opened the notebook she kept near the phone. "I'm listening," she said. "I want to be direct with you," Kane said. "I respect what you've done. I want to say that clearly. The Constellation piece was well executed. I'm not going to insult you by pretending otherwise." She waited. Compliments from men like Victor Kane were preambles, not endpoints. "But I also want you to understand something about the position you're in," he continued. "You have a legal claim. I'm not disputing that. What you don't have is infrastructure, resources, or political capital in this industry. You have leverage. Leverage by itself doesn't build anything." "What are you proposing?" she asked. "A purchase," he said. "Clean, fair, market rate. We buy Constellation and the asset inside it from you. You receive a substantial payment, this entire dispute resolves, and you walk away with enough money to do whatever you want to do next." "What's substantial?" A brief pause. "I think we could reach a number in the range of $40 to $50 million. Naomi wrote it down, underlined it. 40 to 50 million. On paper, it was more money than she'd ever held in her own name. In the context of what Nexus was actually worth, what it had done for Mercer Global's valuation over the past 3 years, what it could do in the hands of a company with the right infrastructure, it was closer to 1/10 of what she was looking at. That's a generous offer, she said. I think it's fair. I think it's early, she said. I think you're offering me a fraction of the asset's value because you believe I'm in a hurry and I'm afraid. A pause that was different from the previous one, more careful. Are you afraid? He asked. I'm cautious, she said. I've been cautious from the beginning. That's different from being afraid, and I think you know that. Ms. Blake, Mr. Kane, she said, I appreciate the call. I genuinely do. If you want to have a conversation about a real number, one that reflects what Nexus has actually contributed to Mercer Global's revenue since deployment, I'm open to that conversation, but I'm not going to accept $40 million for a $200 million asset, because you've sent someone to stand outside my building twice in the past month. The silence that followed was long enough that she wondered, briefly, if she'd made an error. Then Kane said very quietly, I didn't send anyone to stand outside your building. Okay, she said. I'm telling you the truth. Okay, she said again, in the same tone. Another silence. When he spoke again, some of the smoothness had changed, not gone, but shifted. I'd like to continue this conversation when you've had time to consider the offer. I'll be in touch, she said, and hung up. She sat for a moment, her hand, the one holding the pen, was unsteady in a way it hadn't been during the call, the adrenaline arriving after the fact, which was something she'd noticed about herself before. She was functional under pressure and fell apart slightly once the pressure lifted. She'd always found that preferable to the reverse. She wrote 3 words in the notebook under the number she'd underlined. Not Kane's people. If Kane hadn't sent the men outside her building, then someone else had. The possibilities were limited, and none of them were reassuring. She texted Claudia, call me when you can, urgent but not emergency. Then she sat with the call for a few minutes, turning it over. Kane had been careful, polished, and moderately threatening in a way that maintained full deniability. He'd also told her something, possibly by accident. The offer was 40 to 50 million, which meant they'd run the numbers, which meant they knew what Nexus was worth, and 40 to 50 million was what they were willing to spend to make the problem go away quietly. She thought about the phrase, make the problem go away quietly. She thought about the men outside her building. She thought about what the alternative to quiet might look like. She was not going to sell for 40 million, but she was going to need to move faster than she'd planned. The private security firm Claudia recommended was called Ardent Advisory. 4 people, former federal backgrounds, office in Midtown, the kind of business that doesn't advertise. Naomi met with a woman named Diane Stokes, who was compact and careful and asked questions with the efficient quality of someone who had learned to extract information without appearing to extract it. You've been monitored at least twice at your residence, Diane said, reviewing the photographs Naomi had sent. Possibly more times you didn't notice. The car in the second photo is registered to a shell entity in New Jersey. I can trace it further, but it'll take a few days. I want to know who's behind it, Naomi said. We'll find out. Diane closed her folder. In the meantime, I'd recommend some basic changes. Vary your routes. Don't use your regular car service. Use different apps on different days. If you're working from home, close the curtains when you're at your desk near the window. Am I in physical danger? Naomi asked. She asked it directly because she was tired of talking around the things she actually needed to know. Diane looked at her for a moment. You're in a financial dispute with people who have resources and don't like losing. That combination can escalate in ways that are difficult to predict. Right now, I'd assess the risk as surveillance level, information gathering, pressure tactic. I haven't seen anything that suggests they want to do you physical harm. But I'd rather overestimate than underestimate, Diane said. At this point, treat your environment like someone is watching it, because they probably are. Naomi thought about that on the cab ride home. Treat your environment like someone is watching it. She found this less frightening than she expected, possibly because she had been operating that way for months already, logging every contact, documenting every interaction, saving everything to the encrypted drive, building her case the way you build a case when you know the other side has more resources than you do and will use them. What she had was information. What they had was money and connections, and, apparently, hired people with vehicles registered to New Jersey shells. She needed to make sure her information stayed ahead of their money. In December, two things happened roughly simultaneously. The first was that Barrett's fraud motion was denied. The judge, whose name Naomi had researched thoroughly in the days after the filing, had reviewed Claudia's opposition and concluded that there was no material misrepresentation in Naomi's disclosure during divorce proceedings. The placement of Nexus within Constellation Holdings was a corporate decision made by Mercer Global's own financial team, pre-divorce, for tax purposes, and Naomi's decision to request Constellation in the settlement was characterized by the judge as informed negotiation, not concealment. The motion was dismissed with a note that further filings of similar character might be viewed as bad faith litigation. Naomi read the ruling on her laptop at the kitchen table, twice, the same way she read everything important, once fast for the conclusion and once slowly for what the language actually meant. Then she forwarded it to Claudia with no comment because there was nothing to add. The second thing that happened was that Mercer Global missed the second invoice payment. Not late. Missed. 30 days came and went and nothing arrived in the Constellation account. On the 31st day, Claudia received a communication from Barrett stating that Mercer Global was contesting the validity of the invoice given the ongoing ownership dispute, despite the fact that the ownership dispute had just been settled in Naomi's favor. The argument was thin, and Barrett's team knew it was thin. The point was delay. The point was also something else. Every day Mercer Global didn't pay. Every day the legal maneuvering continued. The company was running on Nexus without compensating its legal owner. And every day that continued was a day that accumulated into a number that was going to become very significant in court. They're letting the debt build, Naomi told Claudia. They think they can run up the clock and then negotiate the accumulated amount down as part of a settlement. That's one strategy, Claudia said. It only works if I'm willing to settle, Naomi said. Trigger the escrow provision. Claudia went quiet. Naomi, the escrow provision takes Nexus offline, not just for them, for everyone, if the platform goes into legal escrow. I know what happens, Naomi said. Their network runs at 60%. Delivery's slow. Investors panic. She paused. I know what happens. Do it. This is going to hurt people who have nothing to do with this fight, Claudia said. Drivers, warehouse workers, people downstream. Naomi had thought about this. She had thought about it more than she'd thought about almost anything else in the past month, because she was not the kind of person who moved through the world without considering who her actions affected. She had not liked what she concluded, which was that there was no clean version of what she was doing. There was a version where she accepted $40 million and walked away and let Mercer Global keep the technology she legally owned. And there was a version where she used every tool available to her. The first version left Adrian and Kane intact and functioning and unaccountable. The second version had costs. I know, she said. Trigger it anyway. Mom. The escrow provision activated on a Friday afternoon in the second week of December. Nexus went into legal lockdown at 3 p.m. Eastern. By 4 p.m., Mercer Global's operations center in New Jersey was fielding calls from regional hubs across the country. By 6 p.m., 3 major retail clients had issued formal complaints about delayed shipment notifications. By 9 p.m., a business reporter at a financial news outlet had published a piece about operational disruptions at Mercer Global linked to an unresolved intellectual property dispute with a private holdings company. The piece didn't name Naomi. It named Constellation Holdings. It speculated accurately that the disruption was related to the company's core logistics software. Mercer Global's stock dropped 4% before the market closed that day. It dropped another 6% the following Monday. Adrian called. She didn't pick up. He called again. She sent it to voicemail. He left a message that she listened to once and then saved, because she saved everything. His voice was controlled, but the edges of it weren't, and he said 3 things in the message that her attorney would later characterize as legally inadvisable. She forwarded the voicemail to Claudia. Victor Kane's office called Claudia directly and requested an urgent meeting. Claudia relayed the request. Naomi said she'd consider it. She was sitting at her desk when the call came, looking at the spreadsheet she'd been building, the one that laid out line by line what Nexus had contributed to Mercer Global's growth since its deployment in late 2020. The software had, by her calculation, enabled the company to expand its routing efficiency by 31% and reduce carrier costs by 18%. Applied to Mercer Global's revenue figures over that period, those efficiencies accounted for somewhere between $600 and $800 million in value generation. The number Kane had offered her was $40 to $50 million. She looked at the spreadsheet for a long time. Then she opened a different folder, the one she had been quietly building for the past 4 months, the one that had nothing to do with Nexus or Constellation Holdings or divorce proceedings, the one with the older files, the contract correspondence, the account movements, the names. She was not ready to use it yet, but she had spent 8 weeks organizing it into something that would be comprehensible to people who hadn't spent years inside the industry, to regulators, to journalists, to federal investigators who would need to understand quickly and clearly what they were looking at. It was nearly ready. She closed the folder, made a note in the margin of her notebook, put the pen down. Outside, December had settled over the city with its particular cold clarity, the kind of weather that stripped everything back to its essentials: bare branches against pale sky, the sharp smell of winter air through the window she'd cracked open because the radiator ran hot. She had lived in New York long enough to find this season almost beautiful, which was a thing that took years to acquire. Her phone buzzed. "Maya, just checking in. How are you?" Naomi looked at the message for a moment. She thought about what accurate answer she could give that would also be brief enough for a text message. She thought about the escrow provision, about the stock price, about Victor Kane's careful voice on the phone, about the men outside her building who may or may not have been Kane's. She thought about the folder she'd just closed, the weight of what was inside it, the things she'd been carrying in her pocket for 2 years. "Getting there," she typed. "Call you Sunday?" "Sunday works." "Miss you." "Miss you too," she typed. And meant it, fully, in a way that surprised her a little. She had become so accustomed to operating alone in the past year that she sometimes forgot what it felt like to have someone just checking in because they cared, not because they wanted something. She put the phone down, went back to the spreadsheet. The meeting with Kane's representatives, not Kane himself, but 2 of his associates and 1 of his attorneys, happened in Claudia's conference room on a Wednesday morning in mid-December. Naomi had debated attending. Claudia had advised against it, on the grounds that there was nothing to be gained by giving them direct access to her. Naomi had decided to come anyway, because she wanted to see what they had, and she couldn't fully assess that through secondhand reports. The 2 associates were men in their late 40s, polished and careful. The attorney was a woman named Helen Park, who was clearly the sharpest person in the room and who spent the first 20 minutes establishing that fact without appearing to try. They opened with a revised number, 60 million. "That's a significant improvement," Claudia said, in the neutral tone she used when she was doing exactly the opposite of being moved. "We think it reflects a more realistic view of the asset's value," Helen Park said. "Given the operational disruption caused by the current dispute, we believe a prompt resolution is in everyone's interest." Naomi said, "It doesn't reflect a realistic view. It reflects an upward adjustment designed to see if I'll take it." Helen Park looked at her with an expression that was not quite respect, but was adjacent to it. "What number would you consider realistic?" "That's not the question I'm interested in answering right now," Naomi said. "The question I'm interested in answering is whether this conversation is about acquiring the asset or about making the problem go away." A small silence. "Those can be the same thing," Helen Park said. "They're not, though," Naomi said. "If you want to acquire the asset legitimately at fair market value, that's a real conversation. If you want to pay me enough to get me to stop causing problems, that's a different conversation. I want to know which one we're having." One of the associates, the one on the left who had barely spoken, looked at his colleague. A small look, quickly contained. Naomi caught it. "We're interested in a resolution," Helen Park said carefully. "So am I," Naomi said. "A resolution that reflects what the software is actually worth." She paused. "When you're prepared to have that conversation, call Claudia. We're available." She left before the meeting officially closed, which was something Claudia had not advised and which Naomi did anyway, because she had learned that occasionally the most clarifying thing you can do is let the other side sit in a room with your absence. Diane Stokes called 3 days before Christmas with the result of her trace on the New Jersey vehicle. "The shell is 3 layers deep," Diane said, "but we got through it. The registration traces back to a company called Halcyon Asset Management. Halcyon is a private firm. It's not publicly associated with Mercer Global or Kane Capital. But Roy Hallowell sits on Halcyon's advisory board," Diane said, "has since 2019. Naomi was quiet for a moment. Roy Hallowell, Adrian's CFO, the man who had restructured the Nexus asset placement, the man who had, inadvertently at a dinner party, explained to her how it worked. "Roy sent the men," she said. "Hallowell sent the men," Diane confirmed. "Whether he did it on his own initiative or at someone's direction, I can't tell you that." "It doesn't matter," Naomi said. "Either way, I know whose operation it is." She sat with this for a while after hanging up. Roy Hallowell was not a dramatic figure. He was a careful, numbers-focused man who had worked for Adrian for 9 years, and who had always treated Naomi with the particular brand of polite neutrality that finance people reserve for executives' spouses. She had not disliked him. She had not thought much about him at all. The fact that it was Roy, not Kane's people, not Adrian's direct instruction, but Roy, told her something. It told her that the people around Adrian were more frightened than Adrian himself. Adrian was arrogant. Arrogant people tended to litigate, not intimidate. They believed in their own position too much to feel the need to send men to stand outside buildings. Roy knew what was in the files. Roy knew what Naomi might have found in that archive in 2020. Roy was not arrogant. Roy was scared. She added the Halcyon connection to the folder. The folder was almost ready now. She spent Christmas Eve at her kitchen table with takeout from the Thai place 3 blocks down and a phone call with Maya that lasted 2 hours and covered everything except the parts Naomi couldn't talk about yet, which was most of what was actually happening. Maya told her about her kids and her husband and a renovation they were doing to the kitchen in Chicago that had already gone over budget. Naomi listened and laughed in the right places and felt, for 2 hours, like someone who was having a normal life. After the call ended, she sat in the kitchen with the light on and the rest of the apartment dark and thought about the folder on her encrypted drive. She thought about what it would mean to use it. She had spent so long preparing it, organizing it, making it comprehensible to people who hadn't been inside the company, that sometimes she lost sight of the human weight of what it contained. It wasn't just financial crimes. It wasn't just bribery and contract manipulation. It was years of a company that had been built on something rotten at the base, and the people who had benefited from it, and the people who hadn't known, and the question of what you did when you were the only one with a clear view of all of it. She was not going to pretend that was a simple thing to carry. She was also not going to pretend she had any intention of putting it down. The Christmas lights in the window of the apartment across the street blinked steadily in the dark. She watched them for a while. Then she closed her laptop, washed her takeout container, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. She slept, for the first time in weeks, without waking up in the middle of the night. January came in cold and without ceremony. Naomi had stopped marking time the way she used to, by seasons, by holidays, by the social calendar that had structured her years as Adrian's wife. Now she marked it by the folder, by how ready it was, by how much further she needed to go before she could use it without leaving gaps that a good defense attorney could walk through. The folder was close, but close wasn't there yet. In the first week of January, Claudia called with news about the second invoice. Mercer Global had paid, not the full amount, but 70% of it, with a written note from Barrett claiming the remainder was being withheld pending a formal review of calculation methodology. The note was 5 pages long and said almost nothing. What it actually said, translated out of the legal language, was, "We paid enough to demonstrate good faith. We're holding back enough to maintain leverage. We want you to call us." Naomi did not call them. She instructed Claudia to issue a formal notice that the withheld amount was in breach of the licensing terms, and that if full payment was not received within 15 business days, the escrow provision would activate again. Claudia drafted the notice, sent it, and within 48 hours, Barrett had responded with a request for a phone call. Claudia scheduled it. Naomi did not attend. The result of the call was that the remainder was paid within 10 days. Not because Mercer Global wanted to pay it, because they had run the math on what another escrow activation would cost them in operational disruption, and the math had come out badly. This was, Naomi understood, the rhythm of the fight now. Invoice, delay, notice, payment, repeat. It was not sustainable indefinitely. Eventually the courts or the pressure or something she hadn't anticipated would interrupt the rhythm. But for now it was holding, and holding was what she needed. What she needed more than money at this point was time. Time to finish what she was building alongside the licensing fight. The actual company, the real structure, the thing that would exist after Nexus was eventually sold or litigated into resolution. She had 3 conversations scheduled for January with former logistics executives she'd first contacted in the fall. She had a preliminary term sheet from a venture firm that had heard, through channels she hadn't entirely tracked, that Naomi Blake was doing something interesting with supply chain technology. She had quietly begun the process of hiring 2 engineers who had previously worked on Nexus, who had left Mercer Global in the past year for reasons of their own, to begin developing what she was calling, in the notes on her encrypted drive, the successor architecture. She was building. Slowly, imperfectly, with insufficient sleep and a budget that was getting tighter than she preferred, but she was building. That was the part that kept her functional on the days when the legal maneuvering made her tired and the surveillance made her angry, and the sheer length of the fight made her feel like she was standing at the base of something very tall without being entirely sure she had the right equipment. She was building. That was enough. Claudia Reeves had an office on the 32nd floor of a building on Lexington Avenue, all glass and gray carpet, with a view of the east side that would have been impressive in any other city. In New York, it was just Tuesday. She had been practicing law for 23 years. She had handled high-stakes divorces, corporate disputes, intellectual property cases, one wrongful termination suit that had turned into a federal investigation. She was not a person who was easily rattled. She called Naomi on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of January and said, "I need to see you today, in person. Can you come at 2?" The call was short. Claudia's voice was flat in a way that wasn't her normal flat. It was the flatness of someone controlling something. "What happened?" Naomi asked. 2 o'clock, Claudia said. "Please." Naomi was at the office at 1:50. Claudia met her in the reception area rather than having her wait, which was the first indication of how serious it was. She led her back to the conference room, not her office, the conference room, and closed the door and sat down and put both hands on the table and said, without preamble, "I received a call yesterday afternoon from an attorney I know. He contacted me personally off the record to inform me that he has been approached by representatives of Victor Kane with a proposal." Naomi waited. "The proposal concerns me," Claudia said. "Personally. They have documentation, and I don't know yet how they obtained it or whether it's real, suggesting that I made a procedural error in the original divorce filing. Specifically, they're claiming that I failed to disclose a conflict of interest, that I had a prior professional relationship with you before you retained me." "Did you?" Naomi asked. "We met once," Claudia said. "At a conference in 2019. I gave you my card. We had a 20-minute conversation about a contract question you had. I billed you nothing, I formalized nothing, it was a hallway conversation. But they have a record of it, I don't know from where, and they're characterizing it as an undisclosed prior relationship that should have been disclosed when you retained me for the divorce." "That's thin," Naomi said. "It's extremely thin," Claudia said. "It would almost certainly not survive a bar inquiry. But the bar inquiry itself—" She stopped, pressed her hands flat on the table. "If they file a complaint, even a frivolous one, I'm required to notify all active clients. I would be operating under investigation. The divorce proceedings and everything that followed would be subject to challenge on the grounds that your representation was compromised." "They're not trying to win the complaint," Naomi said. "They're trying to create the cloud." "Yes," Claudia said. "And the attorney who called you, he was delivering a message." Claudia looked at her steadily. "The message was that if we continue to pursue the licensing fees and resist acquisition, the complaint will be filed." Naomi sat with that for a moment. She had been prepared for this. Not this specific shape of it, but the general category. She had known that eventually the pressure would move from her to the people around her. She had known that because it was the rational escalation. If you can't frighten the target directly, you frighten the people the target depends on. What she hadn't fully prepared for was how it would feel to be sitting across from Claudia, who had been sharp and steady and principled through 6 months of this, and see something that looked, under the professional composure, genuinely afraid. "Claudia," she said. "I'm not going to lie to you," Claudia said. "A bar complaint, even one that's ultimately dismissed, is not a small thing. It's not just my practice. There are professional consequences that extend beyond the outcome of the complaint." "I understand." "I have other clients," Claudia said. "I have a staff." She paused. "I'm not saying I'm going to back away from this. I want to be clear about that. I'm telling you what the situation is because you need to know what the situation is." "I know what the situation is," Naomi said quietly. "They're trying to isolate me. Take away the person who knows the most about what I'm doing legally and what my next steps are. If you step back, even temporarily, I lose the continuity. I lose momentum. The licensing clock keeps running, but I'm not in a position to act on it." Claudia nodded. "How long do you need to think about it?" Naomi asked. "I've been thinking about it since yesterday afternoon," Claudia said. "That's why I called you this morning." She folded her hands, unfolded them. "There's something else I need to tell you." Naomi waited. "The attorney who called me," Claudia said, "he told me something I think he wasn't supposed to tell me. Or maybe he was. I can't always read Marcus." She exhaled. "He said that Kane's people have obtained what he called a copy of your secondary materials. Your words, he quoted them back to me." The temperature in the room seemed to drop without actually dropping. Secondary materials. That was the phrase Naomi had used once with Claudia to describe the folder, the financial records, the contract correspondence, the account movements. She had used that phrase in this office, in this room, approximately 2 months ago. She said nothing for a moment. She was doing what she did when something significant happened, running the implications forward quickly, in parallel, without speaking. "He said they have a copy," Claudia said. "Not that they have the originals. A copy." "Which means someone accessed my files," Naomi said. "Or your communications," Claudia said. "I don't know how." "It doesn't matter how." Naomi's voice was level, completely level. She was holding it there by effort. "If they have a copy of the secondary materials, they know what's in them. And if they know what's in them, they know what I can do with them. That's why this is happening now. That's why the complaint thread is happening now. They're not just trying to take away my attorney. They're trying to take away my leverage before I can use it." Claudia said nothing. "They're scared," Naomi said. "Not just of the licensing fees, of the folder." "That would be my read," Claudia said. Naomi stood up. She walked to the window, the unremarkable east side view, January gray, bare trees and a median strip below, and stood there for a moment. Her hands were clasped behind her back, which was something she did when she was thinking and didn't want the thinking visible. She had not been naive about the folder. She had known, from the day she'd first organized it, that the people whose names were in it would not respond well to its existence. She had known that. What she had not expected, and she recognized this as a preparation failure, one she should have anticipated and hadn't, was that they would find out about it before she was ready to use it. She had been careful with her devices. She had used the encrypted drive. She had not emailed the documents or discussed the details over the phone. She had talked about it, in general terms, twice with Claudia, in this room, verbally. Which meant, "The room," she said, without turning around. Claudia looked up. "What?" "This conference room." Naomi turned. "Have you had it swept recently?" A pause. A long one. 6 months ago, Claudia said, "when I upgraded the building's security." 6 months ago, Naomi said. They looked at each other. Claudia reached for her phone, then she set it down. Then she picked up a legal pad and a pen and wrote in block letters, "Leave now. Call me from outside." They stood on the sidewalk on Lexington in the January cold, 2 women in their good coats, Naomi in the charcoal blazer she'd worn to the divorce signing, and Claudia in dark wool, standing close enough to keep their voices low and far enough from the building entrance to be outside whatever range anyone had decided was sufficient. "I'll have the room swept today," Claudia said. Her voice had changed outside. Harder, more decisive. The fear was still there, but it had organized itself into something operational. "If there's a device, we have it. We know what they know." "It doesn't matter what they know at this point," Naomi said. "They have a copy of the files. What matters is what they're going to do with it." "They could use it as leverage," Claudia said. "Hold it over you. If you keep pursuing the licensing fees, they threaten to destroy the evidence before you can get it to federal investigators." "Or they use it to get ahead of me," Naomi said. "Go to the investigators first, control the narrative. Frame Roy or someone expendable as the source of the problem, position Adrian and Kane as cooperating witnesses." Claudia was quiet for a moment. "That's the smart play." "That's the smart play," Naomi agreed. "And they're not stupid." A cab went by. Someone hurried past them, with their head down against the cold. The street had that January quality of movement without warmth. Everyone going somewhere, no one lingering. "How long until your materials are ready to use?" Claudia asked. 2 weeks, Naomi said. "Maybe 3. I need to finish the organizational structure. The chain of evidence needs to be clear enough that a federal investigator can follow it without me sitting in the room explaining it." "You might not have 2 weeks." "I know." "Naomi," Claudia was looking at her directly. "If they've had your communications for any significant time, they know your contacts. They know you've been building a company. They know about the engineers you hired." "I know." "They might try to move against the company formation before it's complete, pull funding, pressure the venture firm." "I know," Naomi said. "I know all of it." She paused, looked at a spot on the sidewalk for a moment. "I need to accelerate." "How?" "The secondary system," Naomi said. Claudia looked at her carefully. "When I first set up the Nexus escrow provision," Naomi said, "I built a second layer into it, a failsafe. If someone attempts unauthorized access to Nexus while it's in legal escrow, not just use but access at the administrative level, it triggers a secondary lockdown that doesn't just restrict the platform. It encrypts the core architecture behind a key that's held by a third party I selected and instructed before the divorce was finalized." Claudia said nothing for a moment. "You built a dead man switch." "I built a dead man switch," Naomi said. "The third party is a law firm in Delaware. They hold the decryption key in escrow. The key releases only under specific conditions that I defined. Conditions that require my direct authorization, or in my absence, a court order obtained by me or my designated representative." "Adrian doesn't know about this." "Nobody knows about this," Naomi said. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want it on record anywhere that could be accessed." She paused. "Until now." Claudia exhaled slowly. "So if they try to go around you, try to access Nexus through back channels while the dispute is ongoing, the whole architecture locks down completely, not 60% operational, 0. And the key to unlock it sits in a Delaware firm with instructions that were sealed before the divorce was finalized and cannot be altered except by me. And if they try to take the key by legal force?" "They can try," Naomi said. "The conditions under which the key releases are structured as a trust instrument. Breaking it would take significant time and a very specific type of legal proceeding that Adrian and Kane would have a very difficult time pursuing without drawing exactly the kind of federal attention they're trying to avoid." Claudia stared at her. Not with surprise exactly. She had stopped being surprised by Naomi months ago, but with something that was close to respect and also close to exhaustion. "You built all of this before the divorce," she said. "I built all of this before the divorce," Naomi said, "because I knew that the day the documents were signed, the fight would start, and I needed to know that I had something that couldn't be taken by the people who had more money than me." A pause. "So what do you need from me?" Claudia asked. "I need you to stay in," Naomi said. "I know what they threatened. I know what it could cost you. I'm not going to tell you it's nothing, because it isn't nothing, but I need—" She stopped, tried again. "I am 2 weeks from having everything I need to end this. Not just the licensing fight, all of it. And I can't do it without someone who knows the legal architecture as well as you do." Claudia looked at her for a long moment. The cold was working its way through their coats. Somewhere up the block, a bus was having some kind of difficulty that involved a horn. "All right," Claudia said. 2 weeks. 2 weeks, Naomi said. "And Claudia, get the room swept today." Sub. She was home by 4. She changed the password on the encrypted drive and moved the folder to a new location on a different drive she'd purchased in cash from an electronics store in the Bronx 2 months ago for exactly this kind of contingency. She went through her phone systematically, not deleting anything, because deletion left its own forensic trace, but reviewing what was there and what someone who had access to her communications might have seen. She found 2 things that concerned her. The first was a text exchange with one of the engineers she'd hired, a man named David Lim, 32, previously senior developer on the Nexus routing module. In the exchange, which was 3 weeks old, she had asked him about a specific technical question regarding the secondary lockdown architecture. The exchange was brief and technical and probably incomprehensible to anyone who hadn't spent time inside the system. But it confirmed to anyone looking that a secondary system existed. They knew. Or if they hadn't known before, they knew now. The second was an email from 6 weeks ago, not to or from her directly, but a forwarded message that Claudia's office had sent her containing a summary of their strategic position. The forwarded message had been sent from Claudia's work account to Naomi's personal email. If Claudia's office had been compromised before the room was swept, that email would have been visible. She sat with both of these facts for a while. The reality of being monitored was something she had known intellectually and was now experiencing in the very specific, uncomfortable way of understanding that people she didn't know had read her words and were building a picture from them. She was not going to panic. Panic was the response they were hoping to trigger, panic or capitulation, and she was not going to give them either, but she needed to move. She called David Lim from a new number, a prepaid phone she'd picked up that same afternoon, cash transaction, no account attached. He picked up on the second ring. "It's me," she said. "Don't use my name. Are you somewhere private?" A pause. "Yeah. What's wrong?" "I think our communications have been monitored," she said. "I can't be specific on this line, but I need you to know the exchange we had 3 weeks ago about the secondary layer. Assume it was seen." David was quiet for a moment. He was sharp. That was why she'd hired him. And she could hear him working through the implications. "If they know it exists," he said carefully, "they might try to get to it before you can use it." "That's what I think," she said. "Can they?" "Not through the architecture," he said. "The secondary layer isn't accessible from the Nexus interface. You'd have to go to the Delaware firm directly. And they can't do that without a court order or your authorization," he said. "Correct." "Okay," she said. "Stay offline for the next few days. Don't use your work devices for anything related to this. I'll be in touch when I have more." "Are you all right?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately because she was trying to figure out what the accurate answer was. "I'm working on it," she said. The call from Kane came 4 days later. Not his office this time. Him directly, same number as before. "Ms. Blake," he said, "I think we need to meet in person." "I think we've had this conversation," she said. "We haven't had this specific conversation," he said. "I have something to propose, something I think you'll want to hear before you make any further decisions." "What kind of proposal?" "The kind I'd rather not describe over the phone," he said. "I'm suggesting a meeting, myself, you, and Adrian, in a neutral location. No attorneys, a direct conversation." Naomi's first instinct was no. Her second instinct was that people who propose meetings without attorneys are either afraid of what attorneys will document or confident enough that they don't need them. She wasn't sure which category Kane fell into, and the uncertainty was its own kind of information. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow," he said. "I'd prefer morning. I'll send you the location." "I want Claudia present," she said. "I specifically suggested no attorneys." "Then I specifically decline," she said. A pause. "All right," he said. "1 attorney each. No other representatives." "Send me the location," she said, and hung up. She called Claudia immediately, told her everything. "Don't go," Claudia said. "I'm going," Naomi said. "Naomi, if they have what they say they have, the copy of the secondary materials, and if they're about to move on it, I need to know what they're planning and when. The only way to know that is to be in the room. She paused. And I need them to believe I'm more rattled than I am. I need them to believe this meeting is costing me something. If I decline, they know I have a plan they don't fully understand. If I show up looking like I'm considering options, they might show me more than they intend to. Claudia was quiet. This is not something I can advise professionally. I know, Naomi said. Come anyway. The location Kane sent was a private club in Midtown, the kind of place where the membership fee discouraged anyone who wasn't supposed to be there, and the dining room had enough ambient noise to prevent anyone at adjacent tables from hearing a conversation they weren't supposed to hear. It was a Thursday morning. Naomi arrived at 9:50 for a 10 o'clock meeting. Claudia was 2 steps behind her. Adrian was already there. She saw him before he saw her, sitting at a corner table, tie loosened in the way he loosened it when he was trying to look casual without actually being casual. He was thinner than the last time she'd seen him, and the thinness wasn't flattering. It made him look like someone who had been under sustained pressure, which was accurate. Kane was already at the table as well. He stood when she approached, because he was the kind of man who stood for women in professional settings in a way that was technically courteous and also slightly proprietary, like courtesy was a form of territory. He was taller than she'd expected. She had never met him in person before, only heard his voice twice now on the phone. Helen Park, Kane's attorney from the December meeting, was to his left. Naomi and Claudia sat. For a moment, nobody spoke. It had that quality of a moment in a room where everyone knows something significant is about to be said, and no one wants to be the first to say it. Adrian said, "You look tired." "You look worried," she said. He opened his mouth, closed it. Kane said, "I'd like to get to the point." "Please," Naomi said. Kane folded his hands on the table. He had the particular composure of a man who had been in difficult rooms before and had learned to wear the difficulty without showing it. "We have a copy of documents that you've been compiling. Financial records, correspondence, materials related to certain contract processes from 2017 through 2019. Naomi said nothing. "We obtained these materials through, let's call it an indirect channel," Kane said. "I won't pretend we obtained them in a way that you'd consider appropriate. What I will tell you is that we have them, and we've had time to review them." "And," she said, "and I want to make you an offer," he said. "A real one. Not 40 million, not 60. A number that reflects what you're actually sitting on and what you could theoretically do with it." He paused. $150 million for Constellation Holdings, full transfer of Nexus, and a mutual non-disclosure agreement that covers everything. The licensing dispute, the divorce proceedings, and he looked at her steadily. "The materials you've been compiling." Helen Park slid a document folder across the table. Naomi didn't open it. "The NDA covers the secondary materials," Naomi said. "That's what you're paying for." Kane held her gaze. "We think it's a fair number." "You think it's a number that makes a significant problem disappear," she said. "Those can be the same thing." She looked at Adrian. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something complicated moving behind the controlled surface. It wasn't contempt, the way it had been in the lawyer's office. It wasn't quite fear. It was something older and less organized, like a person confronting an outcome they had genuinely not considered possible. "You knew," he said, quietly, "about the contracts. You knew when we were still—" He stopped. "How long?" "Long enough," she said. He exhaled through his nose, looked at the table. "What's your counter?" Kane asked. Naomi reached for the document folder and opened it. She scanned the first page. The language was standard NDA structure. She'd seen enough of them to read quickly, but on the 4th page there was a clause she had not expected, an indemnification provision. If she signed, and if the materials she held were subsequently used by any party in any legal proceeding, including proceedings she had not initiated, she would be liable for damages. She looked up. "This indemnification clause," she said to Helen Park, "if federal investigators already have these materials, not from me but from another source, and they open a proceeding, I'd be liable under this language." Helen Park's expression didn't change. "The provision covers materials in your possession or control." "Right," Naomi said. But the provision doesn't specify that the proceeding has to be initiated by me. If someone else triggers a federal investigation using materials they obtained from, let's call it an indirect channel, I'd be exposed under this indemnification even though I never disclosed anything. A silence. Kane's composure, for the first time, showed a hairline fracture. Naomi closed the folder, pushed it back across the table. I'm going to need you to explain why you included this provision, she said. And I'm going to need the explanation to be honest, because I think it tells me something important about whether this offer is real or whether you've already moved the materials somewhere I don't know about. Kane looked at Helen Park. It was a quick look, a half second, but Naomi caught it the same way she'd caught the look between the two associates in December. It was the look of people who had prepared for several responses and were recalibrating to one they hadn't fully anticipated. You've already given them to someone, Naomi said. Kane said nothing. You gave a copy to someone, she said. Not investigators. You wouldn't do that voluntarily. It doesn't serve you. Someone else. Someone you're trying to get ahead of. She looked at Adrian. He was still looking at the table. His jaw was tight. Roy, she said. Adrian looked up. Roy knows what's in those files, she said. Roy's been frightened since before the divorce. Roy sent people to my building, and Roy... She paused, running the logic forward. Roy's been talking to someone. Not you, not Kane. Someone he thinks can protect him if this goes federal. Adrian's expression shifted. Roy went to someone first, Naomi said, and now you're trying to get ahead of Roy. She looked at Kane. The NDA isn't about keeping me quiet. It's about keeping these materials from being used against you in a proceeding that Roy might have already triggered. The silence in the room was very complete. Kane said, Sign the agreement, Ms. Blake. 150 is a real number. It's a very good number. It's not enough, she said. Not for what you're asking me to cover. Name a number, Kane said. It's not about a number, she said. Not anymore. She picked up her bag, looked at Claudia, who was sitting very still and very straight, and who had not said a word since they sat down. Claudia gave her the smallest nod, barely perceptible, just enough. I'll be in touch, Naomi said, and stood. Ms. Blake. Kane's voice was still controlled, but the smoothness was gone. If you walk out of this room without an agreement, if you've already given those materials to Roy's contact, she said, then we're both past the point where an agreement does you much good. She held his gaze for a moment. But you already know that. That's why you're so eager to sign today. She left. Claudia was beside her. They didn't speak until they were out of the building and half a block away, walking fast into the January cold. The indemnification clause, Claudia said. I know. They've already moved the materials somewhere. Roy went to someone, a federal contact probably, someone he's been cultivating as protection. Which means the investigation might already be open, Naomi said, or close to open. Claudia was quiet for a moment. Which means your timeline just collapsed. My timeline just collapsed, Naomi confirmed. She was walking quickly, not sure exactly where she was going, just moving because movement felt better than standing still when the world was reorganizing itself around her. The cold was sharp and real, and she let herself feel it, the bite of it on her face, the sting of it in her eyes. It helped. I need to get to the folder tonight, she said. Whatever isn't finished, it has to be finished tonight, or tomorrow at the latest. And then? And then I decide who to give it to first, she said. And how, and in what order. She paused. And I need to do it before Kane figures out that I know about Roy. Because the moment he knows I know, the window closes. She stopped walking. They were at the corner of a block she didn't immediately recognize. Midtown, glass and stone, a pretzel cart, two pigeons with opinions about the sidewalk. Ordinary city things, going on entirely without regard for the fact that everything had just changed. 2 days? She said. Claudia looked at her. You said 2 weeks. I said 2 weeks 3 days ago, Naomi said. Now I have 2 days. She hailed a cab, got in, gave her address. The cab pulled into traffic and the city folded around her the way it always did. Dense, indifferent, ongoing. She opened her bag, took out the legal pad she always kept there, wrote a single line across the top of a blank page. Finished tonight. Underlined it once. Then she started writing. She worked through the night. Not the romanticized version of working through the night, not with music playing and coffee steaming and a sense of purpose humming through everything. It was the other kind. The kind where the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning feel like something physical pressing down on you, where your eyes start to blur at the edges and you have to stand up and walk to the kitchen and back just to remember that your body is still attached. She made 3 cups of coffee and drank 2 of them cold because she forgot about them. She ate half a granola bar at some point and didn't finish it. The folder had been organized for weeks, but organized for her own use, for someone who already knew the architecture of what she'd found, who understood what each document connected to and why the sequence mattered. What she needed now was something different. She needed it organized for someone who had never been inside Mercer Global, who had no prior knowledge of the contract awards or the account structures, or the specific regulatory frameworks that made what Adrian and Kane had done not just ethically questionable, but federally criminal. She was building a narrative out of documents. That was the work. Not interpretation, she was careful to let the documents speak, but structure, sequence. Context provided by public records and regulatory filings that anyone could access, woven around the private materials in a way that made the picture impossible to miss. By 6 in the morning, she had a draft. By 8, she had something she thought a federal investigator could follow in under an hour. She sent it to Claudia at 8:15 with a single line. Review today. We move tomorrow. Claudia called 20 minutes later. I haven't slept either, she said without explanation. Did they sweep the conference room? Yesterday afternoon, Claudia said. They found something. Small device, power outlet behind the credenza. It had been there. The text said at least 60 days based on the battery. 60 days. Naomi ran the math. 60 days back from now put the installation in late November, after the December meeting with Kane's associates, after the bar complaint threat, but during the period when she and Claudia had been discussing the federal materials most actively. Okay, she said. Naomi. I know, she said. We already knew they had the materials. The device just tells us when they got them and confirms the room was the source. It doesn't change anything. It changes what Barrett might do with the bar complaint, Claudia said. If they file it now, they're not going to file it, Naomi said. Filing the complaint puts Kane in the position of having obtained information through an illegal recording device. The moment the complaint triggers any kind of review, the device becomes discoverable. They won't risk it. A pause. You're sure? I'm sure they're not stupid, Naomi said, and I'm sure that right now, with Roy potentially talking to federal contacts, the last thing Kane wants is any additional attention on his methods. She looked at the document on her screen. Review the package. Call me this afternoon. We need to decide who gets it first. The question of who gets it first was not simple. There were 3 realistic options, and each had a different risk profile. The first was the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which had jurisdiction over the financial fraud components, specifically the contract-related account movements that had affected publicly traded entities. The second was the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, which had broader jurisdiction but slower processes. The third was a journalist, specifically 2 journalists Naomi had identified over the past several months as covering the logistics and infrastructure finance space with enough sophistication to understand what they were looking at. Going to regulators first was the legally cleanest path. It established Naomi as a cooperative source rather than someone using the information as leverage, which protected her from any argument that she was engaged in extortion. The downside was time. Regulatory processes were slow, and in the gap between submission and action, Kane had room to maneuver. Going to journalists first was faster and more public, but harder to control. Once a story was published, the narrative belonged partly to the story, and Naomi had no way to ensure it would be accurate or complete enough to be legally significant rather than just damaging. The hybrid option, simultaneous submission to a regulator and a journalist, timed so that the regulatory filing arrived first, but the publication followed within hours, was the most aggressive play. It was also the one that left the least room for interference. If the regulator received the materials at 9 in the morning and a story appeared by noon, the window for Kane to control the situation was 4 hours. 4 hours against a complete, documented, organized package was not enough time. When Claudia called at 2 in the afternoon, Naomi laid it out. The hybrid, Claudia said after a moment. The hybrid, Naomi said. Who's the journalist? Naomi had two names. She'd been watching their work for months. One was at a major financial publication. The other was an independent investigative reporter with a track record of stories that had led directly to federal action. She chose the independent reporter. His name was Carter Webb, and he had broken a municipal bond fraud story in 2022 that had resulted in 4 indictments. He was careful. He verified. He would not publish until he understood what he had. I'll reach out today, Naomi said. Informal first contact, no materials, just... Does he have the capacity to look at something significant in the next 48 hours? And the regulatory filing? Tomorrow morning, Naomi said. We file with the SEC and simultaneously notify the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Not as an either-or, both, same morning. 48 hours after I make contact with Webb. Claudia was quiet for a moment. You've thought about whether they'll try to move against you physically before you can file. I've thought about it. And? I've thought about it, Naomi said again, which was not an answer, and they both knew it. I'm moving the drives tonight, copies to 3 separate locations. One with you, physically. One with an attorney in Delaware who's been holding the trust instrument. One with Maya. Your sister. She doesn't need to know what's on them. She just needs to hold a drive I send her. Naomi, if something happens to me before I can file, Naomi said, I need the materials to survive. That's the point. I'm not being dramatic. I'm being practical. The silence on Claudia's end was the kind that contained things that weren't being said. Okay, Claudia finally said. I'll be at my office tomorrow by 7. Have everything to me tonight. Mott. Carter Webb responded to her initial contact within 4 hours. A brief professional email that said he had capacity and would be interested in a preliminary conversation. She called him from the prepaid phone at 9 that evening. He was not excitable. That was the first thing she noticed. Some journalists, when they sensed a significant story, developed a quality of barely contained energy that was both understandable and slightly alarming if you were the source. Webb was the opposite, careful, methodical, the kind of person who asked precise questions and waited for complete answers before asking the next one. Without getting into specifics, she said, I want to tell you what you're looking at in general terms. Federal contract procurement, 3 awards over a 2-year period, account movements in the weeks preceding each award, moving between entities with relationships to the procurement officials involved, supporting correspondence. A pause. How complete is the documentation? Complete enough to follow without me in the room explaining it, she said. I've organized it so a person unfamiliar with the industry can understand the sequence. How did you obtain it? I was in a position to access archived corporate documents, and I found materials that were not intended to be findable, she said. I'm prepared to discuss the circumstances in detail, on record, when we meet in person. I want to be transparent about how I have what I have. Another pause. You said federal contract procurement? Are we talking about a company that's publicly identified? Yes. Size? Significant, she said. Public company, known name. Are you the only source for these materials? This was the question she'd expected and had prepared for. No, she said. I believe another party obtained a copy through, let's say, less transparent means, which is partly why I'm moving now rather than waiting. Webb processed that. You're concerned someone else will control the story. I'm concerned someone else will control the evidence, she said. I want the materials in the hands of people who will use them appropriately before anyone has the opportunity to make them disappear. Can you get me a preliminary package tomorrow? Nothing that identifies the company directly. I just need enough to assess whether I can commit resources. Tomorrow afternoon, she said. Claudia Reeves, my attorney, will be the point of contact. She'll send you what you need. She hung up and sat for a moment in the dark of the second bedroom, the desk lamp making a small circle of light on the surface in front of her. The drives were already copied and packaged. She would ship one to Maya tomorrow, a hard drive in a padded envelope with a brief handwritten note that said, keep this safe, and don't open it. And Maya, to her credit, would almost certainly do exactly that without asking why, because that was the kind of sister she was. She thought about calling Maya now, not about the drive, just to hear her voice. Then she looked at the time. It was past 10. Maya had young kids and a kitchen renovation and a full life, and the last thing she needed was her sister calling at 10 p.m. to talk without being able to say anything. Naomi turned off the desk lamp, sat in the dark for a minute. Then she got up, went to bed, and slept 4 hours. Chab. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold in the way of late January in New York, which is to say it arrived without apology. Naomi was up at 5:30. She showered, dressed in the charcoal blazer, and was out the door by 6:45 with a bag that contained her laptop, both drives, the legal pad with 4 pages of notes, and a container of coffee she'd made at home because she didn't trust herself to make decisions about anything before the caffeine was active. She took 3 different subway lines to get to Claudia's office. Not because the route made geographic sense, it didn't, but because Diane Stokes had told her 6 weeks ago that anyone following her would be most exposed during a transfer between transit lines. And if she varied the transfers enough, she could identify a tail within 3 stops. She did not identify one. That was either reassuring or they were better at it than she'd anticipated, and she'd decided some time ago to operate as if it was the latter. Claudia was at her office when Naomi arrived. There was a second attorney present, a man named James Cho, who specialized in whistleblower law and had been briefed by Claudia the previous evening. James was quiet and precise and had the slight quality of someone who found legal complexity genuinely interesting in a way that was occasionally inconvenient but mostly useful. He had reviewed the regulatory filing structure overnight. The SEC submission needs one adjustment, he said, without preliminary. The chain of custody section on the 2018 materials, you have a gap between the initial archive access and the date you transferred the files to the encrypted drive. That gap needs to be filled with a sworn statement from you describing the interval. I can do that this morning, Naomi said. It needs to be done before we file, he said. The gap is small, but it's the kind of thing a defense attorney uses to question the integrity of the package. I'll do it now, she said. He slid a legal pad across the table. She wrote the statement longhand, date of access, circumstances of access, what she did with the materials between finding them and securing them, the time interval involved. It took 20 minutes. James reviewed it, made 2 minor suggestions about specificity, she revised it, and it was done. By 9:15, the SEC submission was complete. By 9:30, the FBI Financial Crimes Unit had received a parallel notification with the materials attached. By 9:40, Claudia had sent Carter Webb the preliminary package. Naomi sat in the conference room, the newly swept conference room, with its clean outlets and its clear air, and drank her second cup of coffee and felt, for a strange moment, completely empty. Not defeated, not relieved, just empty. The way you feel when you have been carrying something for a very long time and you have finally set it down and your body hasn't caught up to the absence yet. Now we wait, Claudia said. Now we wait, Naomi agreed. But she did not go home to wait. She went to Mercer Global. This was not part of any plan she had discussed with Claudia or James. She hadn't decided to do it until she was in the cab, having told the driver an address that came out of her mouth before she'd consciously formed the intention. She sat with the decision for 3 blocks and then let it stand. The Mercer Global headquarters occupied 4 floors of a building in the West 50s. Not the flashiest address in Midtown, but close enough to everything that mattered that it said what it was supposed to say. She had been there hundreds of times over the years. She had attended company events in the lobby, had sat in the executive dining room, had walked through the open-plan floors during the early years when Adrian had been building the company, and had sometimes brought her along as, she understood now, a kind of prop, a visual representation of stability. She did not go upstairs. She sat in the lobby. The lobby of Mercer Global was the kind of corporate lobby designed to communicate permanence. Marble floors, the company name in raised metal letters on one wall, a reception desk staffed by 2 people who were currently both on phones. There were couches along one wall that were too low to be comfortable, which was apparently intentional in corporate lobbies, meant to remind visitors that comfort was not the point. Naomi sat in one of the uncomfortable couches and looked at the raised metal letters and thought about the first time she'd been in this building. It had been 11 years ago, before the company had occupied this space. They'd been in a smaller office uptown, and she'd come to bring Adrian lunch because they were still in the early phase of the marriage when gestures like that felt meaningful. He'd been pleased to see her. She remembered that specifically, the genuine warmth of it, the way he'd introduced her to his assistant as my wife. She's the smart one, which was both sweet and slightly reductive, but which she'd let pass because in those years there were things she'd let pass that she later wished she hadn't. She was not here for sentiment. She was not entirely sure why she was here, except that this place represented something that needed to be witnessed directly, the sight of what was about to happen. And there was something in her that needed to be present for it physically, rather than hearing about it from a cab uptown. At 10:45, Carter Webb sent a 3-word message to Claudia's phone, which Claudia relayed to Naomi. I see it. Talking. At 11:20, Claudia called. SEC acknowledged receipt. They've assigned it to a unit. James says that's faster than standard intake, which suggests they already had something open. Roy, Naomi said quietly. That would be my read, Claudia said. They may have had a preliminary file and this gave them enough to move. How fast does that change the timeline? James says if they already have an open file, they could move to a formal investigation within days. Maybe sooner if the FBI coordinates. A pause. Naomi, where are you? Mercer Global Lobby. A silence. Why? I needed to be somewhere that was real, she said. It sounded strange out loud. She didn't take it back. Claudia said, Come back to the office when you're ready. I think things are going to move quickly now. Things moved quickly. At 1:17 in the afternoon, Naomi was back at Claudia's office when Claudia's assistant knocked on the conference room door and said there was a call coming in on the main line from a number registered to Mercer Global's general counsel. Claudia took it in her office. She was in there for 11 minutes. When she came back out, her expression was contained in the way of someone containing something large. Mercer Global's GC called personally, Claudia said. She says the board called an emergency meeting this morning. She says, Claudia sat down. She says they've been informed by their outside counsel that federal investigators have made contact regarding an ongoing matter. She was careful about language. She didn't say what the matter was. The board knows, Naomi said. The board knows something is happening, Claudia said. She said the board is... Her word was concerned about the company's exposure, and she asked whether there was any possibility of an expedited resolution on the Nexus licensing matter. Naomi looked at her. They want to settle. The GC was careful not to use that word, Claudia said. But yes. What did you tell her? I told her I'd relay the message, Claudia said. James, who had been sitting quietly in the corner with his laptop, looked up. If the board is moving to distance itself from the current leadership, that's a significant development. It means they're calculating that the investigation is real and that Adrian doesn't survive it. It means they're trying to separate the company from the man, Naomi said. Which they may be able to do, James said. Companies survive criminal investigations of their leadership more often than you'd think, especially if the board moves quickly to demonstrate cooperation and governance reform. And Kane? Naomi asked. Kane is the more complicated question, James said. His exposure depends on what the investigators find and how they characterize the relationship between Kane Capital and the contract procurement process. If they can establish that Kane had direct knowledge, he did, Naomi said. There's correspondence in the package. 2 emails from Kane to a third party that were CC'd to the procurement account. He didn't write anything direct, but the timing and the context make the relationship clear. James made a note. That'll be for the investigators to assess. The point is that whatever Kane's exposure is, it's real, and he knows it, which is why he was so eager to buy your silence yesterday. Naomi thought about the meeting, Kane's composure with its hairline fracture, the indemnification clause, his voice when she'd stood to leave. If you walk out of this room without an agreement. She had walked out. The agreement was not signed. She wondered, briefly, if he was in that building right now. If Adrian was. If Roy Hallowell was somewhere in a room with an attorney trying to work out the math on cooperation. She didn't feel satisfaction, exactly. She felt the particular exhaustion of a very long effort reaching its critical point, the moment when you've done what you can do and the rest is no longer in your hands. At 3:48 that afternoon, Carter Webb published. The story went up on his independent platform first and was picked up by two major financial outlets within the hour. It was careful and well documented and attributed entirely to public records and a confidential source with direct knowledge. It described, in precise and methodical language, a pattern of account movements preceding 3 federal contract awards to Mercer Global Logistics between 2017 and 2019. It described the entities involved, the timing, and the amounts. It named Adrian Mercer. It named Victor Kane. It did not name Roy Halliwell. Webb had apparently chosen not to complicate the central narrative with a figure the general audience wouldn't recognize. Naomi read it on her phone in Claudia's conference room. She read it twice. Then she put the phone down. James said, "The story is clean." He was careful. He was careful, Naomi agreed. Claudia was watching her with an expression that contained a question she wasn't asking. "I'm fine," Naomi said. "I'm fine. She stopped. "I've been holding this for 4 years, since 2020. I found those files in 2020, and I put them back in the archive, and I went home, and I didn't tell anyone, and I carried it for 4 years. She paused. "I'm not sure what to do with the fact that it's out now." Claudia said nothing. James said nothing. The room was quiet except for the ambient sound of the building, the climate control, a phone ringing somewhere, the ordinary texture of other people's days continuing as if nothing particularly significant had just happened. "Okay," Naomi said. "What happens now, Shetum?" What happened now was not quiet. By 4:30, Mercer Global's stock had been halted by the exchange pending clarification of the situation. By 5 o'clock, 3 members of the board had issued a joint statement describing the investigation as a serious matter that the board takes with the utmost concern, and noting that outside counsel had been retained. By 6, an attorney representing Adrian Mercer had issued a statement that said very little in a great many words. Kane Capital made no statement. At 6:40, Claudia's phone rang. She took it. Came back 2 minutes later. "That was James's contact at the FBI unit," she said. "They're moving tonight." "Tonight," Naomi said. "They wanted to move before anyone had the opportunity to transfer assets or leave the jurisdiction. The story being public accelerates their timeline." Naomi nodded slowly. She had expected this, had known that once the story was out, the investigators would want to move quickly before the situation became any more complicated. But knowing it and hearing they're moving tonight were different things in the way that most things she'd known intellectually turned out, eventually, to be different when they became actual. "Is there anything I need to do?" she asked. "James is going to stay available in case they want a direct contact with you tonight," Claudia said. "For now, go home. You've done what needed to be done." "Go home," Naomi repeated. "Go home," Claudia said. Bob. She didn't go directly home. She walked for a while first, which was something she did when her mind needed more time than her feet required. The evening had come down cold and clear over Midtown, the kind of winter evening where the sky goes that particular shade of dark blue before it goes fully dark, and the lights of the buildings come on, and the city does its evening thing of transforming slightly, more purposeful in the morning, more alive in this hour. She walked west, without a specific destination, and thought about the sequence of the day, the filing, the lobby, the story. They're moving tonight. She thought about Adrian in some room right now with his attorneys, with the phone ringing and the stock halted and the board having already started to calculate the distance between the company and the man whose name was on the building. She thought about what that must feel like, not with sympathy, but with the particular human interest in consequences. What was it like to be in the room where the thing you built was starting to separate from you, the way a boat separates from a dock in the moment just before the current takes it? She passed a restaurant where something good was cooking, garlic, something braised, the smell of a place that had been open long enough to have absorbed warmth into its walls. She stopped walking, looked at the menu in the window without reading it. Then she went in and sat at the bar and ordered something from a person who did not know her name or her history or anything about the past 14 months, which was one of the underrated aspects of large cities, the perpetual availability of strangers. She ate without really tasting it. Her phone buzzed twice, both from Claudia, brief updates, nothing requiring her action. She responded to both with okay and put the phone face down on the bar. The television above the bar was showing a financial news channel. She watched it without sound. At some point during her second glass of water, a chyron appeared at the bottom of the screen that included Mercer Global's ticker symbol and the word halted. The anchor was talking at a pace that suggested something significant. She did not turn the sound up. She paid her check and walked the rest of the way home. At 9:17 that evening, she was at her kitchen table when Claudia called. "It happened," Claudia said. Naomi said nothing. "Federal agents went to the Mercer Global building at 8 o'clock, Claudia said. Adrian was there. He'd apparently been in the building all afternoon. They arrested him at the headquarters. Kane was taken into custody at his apartment on the Upper East Side about 40 minutes later." A pause. "Roy Halliwell voluntarily surrendered himself to federal authorities this afternoon. James's contact says he's been cooperating since November." November. Roy had gone to federal contacts in November, which meant while the men he'd sent were standing outside Naomi's building in October and November, Roy himself had been quietly walking toward the exit he'd identified, the one that involved giving investigators enough to work with in exchange for what he hoped would be a softer landing. "Roy bought himself a deal," Naomi said. "That's what it looks like," Claudia said. She thought about Roy Halliwell, careful, numbers-focused, perpetually neutral. She didn't like what he'd done. She also understood the calculation he'd made. When the ship started listing, you had to decide very quickly whether you were going to go down with it or get off. Roy had made his decision in November. She'd made hers years before, and the decision had looked different from the outside. "The Mercer Global GC called again," Claudia said, "while you were at the restaurant. The board wants to proceed with a full settlement on the Nexus matter as soon as legally possible. They want the licensing dispute resolved. The company needs to be able to operate Nexus without the escrow condition, and they're in a position to negotiate." "What kind of number are they thinking?" "She didn't give a number," Claudia said. She said the board is prepared to be responsive to a fair market valuation. Those were her exact words. Fair market valuation. Not 40 million, not 60. Not even the 150 that Kane had offered as his version of a real number. Fair market valuation, which, if they were using anything close to the methodology Naomi had developed in her spreadsheet, was somewhere north of $600 million. She was quiet for a long moment. "Are you all right?" Claudia asked. She stopped, started again. "I'm trying to figure out what I feel, and I keep coming up with things that don't quite fit." She looked at the bare wall across the kitchen, the wall where she hadn't hung anything yet, the wall that was still the color it had been when she moved in. "I don't feel like I won something. I feel like something ended." "Those are different things," Claudia said. "Yeah," Naomi said, "they are." After Claudia hung up, she sat for a while in the kitchen. She thought about calling Maya, but it was too late and there was too much she couldn't explain. She thought about the Greenwich house, where she had spent 11 years of her life and which belonged to Adrian, or had before today, before the federal agents arrived and the assets became something other than his to control. She thought about the photograph on the wall in the second bedroom. Herself at 31. The server rack. The exhausted, satisfied face. She wondered what version of herself existed now, at 43, after 14 months of the most consequential thing she had ever done. She couldn't quite see it yet. That was probably normal. You couldn't see yourself clearly in the middle of the aftermath, any more than you could see a landscape clearly while standing in it. She would see it eventually. She got up, washed the coffee mug from that morning, which had been sitting in the sink all day, dried it, put it away. Tomorrow, she and Claudia would begin the negotiation with Mercer Global's board. Tomorrow, there would be numbers and terms and the careful legal architecture of an ending. Tomorrow, there would be the start of whatever came after. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, she stood at her kitchen sink in her Upper West Side apartment, with the city outside doing its late evening things, the distant sound of traffic, a light in the apartment across the way, someone's music 2 floors down, and she let herself have the full weight of the day without trying to organize it into anything. The arrests, the story, the filing, the 4 years of carrying the folder in the pocket of her everyday life. The man who had stood in the conference room in this same blazer and told her she was taking trash and laughed at her on his way out. She let herself have all of it. Then she turned off the kitchen light, and the apartment went dark, and she went to bed. The negotiation with Mercer Global's board took 11 days. Not the weeks or months that Naomi had originally anticipated. The arrests had changed the math for everyone. A company under federal investigation, with its CEO in custody and its largest outside investor facing criminal charges, does not negotiate the way a healthy company negotiates. It negotiates the way a person negotiates when they are standing in a burning building and someone is holding the door. The board needed the Nexus escrow lifted. They needed operational continuity restored. They needed, more than anything, to demonstrate to their remaining institutional investors that the company could function independently of the man whose name had appeared in every federal filing so far. They needed Naomi more than she needed them. That was new. That was the thing that took some adjustment. Patricia Cho, the board director who had called Claudia's office months ago asking if there was a conversation to be had, led the negotiation on the company's side. She was composed and direct and clearly exhausted in the way of someone who had been managing a crisis for weeks and was operating on professionalism because most of the other options had been used up. Naomi found herself respecting Patricia in the specific way you respect an opponent who is doing their job well under terrible conditions. The respect was genuine and did not make Naomi move an inch on the numbers. The final figure was $640 million, not for the company Naomi was building, not for the licensing fees already accumulated. For Constellation Holdings, for Nexus itself, the full transfer of the intellectual property asset to a restructured Mercer Global operating under interim board leadership pending the outcome of the federal proceedings. Clean transfer. No trailing liability for Naomi. No conditions on how she used the proceeds. $640 million wired to an account that belonged entirely to Naomi Blake. She was in Claudia's conference room when the wire confirmation came through. The newly swept conference room, which Claudia had swept again the week before and would sweep monthly going forward because some lessons are worth their cost. James Cho was there. Claudia was there. There was a bottle of champagne that James had brought and that nobody had opened yet because opening it felt premature until the confirmation actually arrived. When it arrived, Claudia opened the champagne. She poured 3 glasses. They drank. The champagne was good. Naomi drank half her glass and then set it down and sat with her hands folded on the table and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was not exactly a celebratory posture, but was the honest one. "You're allowed to be happy," James said. He said it without irony, which was why she didn't deflect it. "I know," she said. "I'm working on it." Claudia refilled her own glass. "What do you need right now, practically?" "A tax attorney," Naomi said. "A good one, and probably a week where nobody calls me." Claudia laughed. A real laugh, not the professional approximation of one. It was the first time Naomi had heard Claudia actually laugh in months, and it had the quality of something released rather than produced. "I'll find you the tax attorney," Claudia said. "The week is your problem." She called Maya that evening. Not with a plan for the conversation, she'd learned over the course of the past year that conversations with Maya went better when she didn't script them, because Maya had an instinct for scripts and would push past them until she got to the actual thing. Naomi let the phone ring twice and thought about hanging up and then didn't. Maya picked up on the 3rd ring. "Hey you, I got the package you sent. I've been holding it exactly where you said." "I know," Naomi said. "You can open it." A pause. "Should I be worried about what's in it?" "There's nothing dangerous," Naomi said. "It's just files. You don't need to do anything with them. I just needed copies somewhere safe." "Okay," Maya said, in the tone of someone who had more questions and was choosing not to ask them. "How are you?" Naomi thought about the wire confirmation, about the champagne, about sitting at the kitchen table last night with the light off and listening to the city. "Something ended today," she said. "The main thing. It's done." Maya was quiet for a moment. "The Adrian thing." "The Adrian thing," Naomi said, "and other things that came with it. Are you okay?" "I think I'm going to be okay," Naomi said. "I'm not quite there yet, but I can see it from where I'm standing." "That's different from what you said a year ago," Maya said. "What did I say a year ago?" You said you were okay in the way that meant you were holding everything together with tape and willpower, and you needed me to not ask too many questions. Naomi almost smiled. Yeah, that's a different kind of okay. Do you want to come to Chicago? Maya asked. Not for a reason. Just come for a few days. Eat actual food. Let the kids drive you crazy. Go for a walk along the lake. Naomi thought about her apartment, the bare walls, the kitchen table, the second bedroom that was her office and had been her entire world for 14 months. Yes, she said, I do. Next week? Next week, Naomi said. She hung up and sat for a while in the quiet. The city was doing its usual evening thing outside. She looked at the photograph on the wall, herself at 31, the server rack, the exhausted and satisfied face, and thought about the version of herself that had put that photograph up 8 months ago and what that person had needed to remember. That there had been a self before the self she'd become inside the marriage. That the self before was capable and real and hadn't gone anywhere. She thought that woman would recognize her now. She thought they'd have things to say to each other. The federal proceedings moved faster than anyone had publicly predicted, which James attributed to the quality of the cooperative testimony Roy Hallowell had provided and the completeness of the documentation package Naomi had submitted. She was not in the courtroom for any of it. She was contacted twice by federal investigators for clarifying questions about the materials she'd provided, both times through James, both times resolved without her needing to appear in person. She followed the proceedings the way she followed most things now, carefully, from a slight distance, without letting them occupy more space in her attention than they deserved. The proceedings were consequential. They were not her life. Adrian was charged with bribery of federal procurement officials, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The indictment was 23 pages. His attorney entered a not guilty plea and gave a statement that was 4 sentences of careful language that said nothing. 3 weeks later, the same attorney negotiated a plea agreement. Adrian pleaded guilty to 2 counts, the bribery and the conspiracy, in exchange for cooperation and a sentencing recommendation. The federal judge reviewed the agreement and sentenced him to 11 years, with the possibility of supervised release after 8. 11 years. 1 for each year of the marriage, which was the kind of coincidence that meant nothing and which Naomi noticed anyway. She read the sentencing report on her laptop on a Tuesday morning in March, sitting at a cafe near her apartment where the coffee was better than the coffee she made at home. She read it twice. The report described Adrian as having demonstrated a sustained pattern of calculated conduct that corrupted public procurement processes for private financial gain. It described the harm as extending beyond financial damage to the integrity of federal contracting systems upon which the public depends. She closed the laptop, drank her coffee, watched 2 pigeons have an argument over a piece of pastry on the sidewalk outside. She did not feel triumph. She had stopped expecting triumph somewhere around month 4 of the fight, when she'd understood that what she was doing was not about winning a thing, but about correcting one. The distinction mattered. Winning implied the other person lost, and the framework of winning and losing kept you inside the same logic that had created the problem. The logic that said power was a fixed resource, and you either had it or someone else did. What she'd done was different. What she'd done was closer to, she turned the word over in her mind, looking for the right one, restitution. Not revenge. Restitution. Returning something that had been taken to the condition it should have been in. She was aware that this was a generous framing of her own motivations. She was also aware that her motivations had not been entirely clean, that somewhere in the 14 months of careful, methodical work, there had been moments of satisfaction at Adrian's discomfort that were not purely principled. She had been angry. She had wanted him to understand what he had dismissed. Those were human things, not especially admirable, and she was not going to pretend they hadn't been there. But they hadn't been the engine. That was the thing she kept coming back to. The anger had been real, but the engine had been something else, something closer to a refusal. A refusal to accept that the version of her life she'd been handed at the end of the marriage was the only version available. A refusal to believe that preparation and intelligence and 4 years of careful documentation counted for nothing against money and connections, and the assumption that she would take what she was given and go away quietly. She had not gone away quietly. She left a tip on the table and went to her office. Victor Kane's case proceeded on a parallel track and resolved 6 weeks after Adrian's sentencing. Kane's attorneys fought harder and longer, as Kane's attorneys had significantly more resources to fight with, and the cooperation question was more complicated because Kane had not, unlike Roy, made the decision to cooperate early. He had made the decision to fight, and he had fought well, and it had cost him more than capitulation would have. The jury deliberated for 4 days. They found Kane guilty on 3 counts: conspiracy to commit bribery, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. The obstruction charge stemming, in part, from the bar complaint threat against Claudia and the recording device in her conference room, which federal investigators had been able to tie to Halcyon Asset Management, and through Halcyon to Kane's operational network. He was sentenced to 14 years. Kane said nothing at sentencing, not the careful nothing of a prepared statement, just actual silence. His attorney spoke. Kane sat with his hands folded on the defense table and looked at a point somewhere above the judge's head and said nothing. Naomi was not there to see it, but Carter Webb was, and his account of it appeared in a piece he published the following day. She read the piece carefully, the way she read everything Webb wrote. He was good, precise, and consistently fair in a way that made her trust his account of a room she hadn't been in. Kane appeared diminished, Webb wrote, in the way of men who have spent decades operating from a position of certainty and who have encountered, for the first time, a situation that certainty could not resolve. She thought about that line for a while. Spain. She thought about the meeting in the private club. Kane's smooth voice, the hairline fracture in his composure when she'd identified the indemnification clause, the way he'd looked at Helen Park. She thought about what it must have taken to be that certain, for that long, and what it felt like when the certainty ran out. She was not glad he was diminished. That surprised her a little. She had expected gladness and found instead something more neutral, a kind of completed accounting. The column that had been open for years was now closed. Roy Halliwell received a reduced sentence of 3 years, suspended to 18 months with cooperation credit, plus substantial financial penalties and a permanent bar from serving as an officer or director of any public company. His attorney framed it as accountability without destruction. The federal judge noted in her remarks that Roy's cooperation had been instrumental and that this fact had been given significant weight in the sentencing. Naomi thought about Roy sending the men to stand outside her building in October. She thought about Roy simultaneously, apparently walking toward his federal contact in November. 2 things happening at the same time, pressure and self-preservation, coexisting in the same person, both genuine. That was not simple. She had given up expecting people to be simple a long time ago. In April, she went to Chicago. Maya's house was a 3-bedroom in a neighborhood with good coffee shops and a park with a lake path where you could walk for an hour and feel like the city had temporarily become something else. Maya's kids, 9 and 6, a girl and a boy, treated Naomi with the particular intensity that children reserve for adults who are present but slightly unfamiliar, which meant they followed her around the first day asking questions, and by the second day were treating her like furniture, which she found considerably more comfortable. She slept 8 hours a night for the first time since before the divorce. She ate actual meals at an actual table with other people. She went for walks along the lake and let her mind do whatever it needed to do without directing it, which produced mostly nothing in a way that felt like recovery. On the 3rd evening, after the kids were in bed, she and Maya sat at the kitchen table with wine. She'd started drinking again, modestly, now that the need for constant sharpness had eased, and had the conversation they'd been deferring for months. "Tell me what actually happened," Maya said. "All of it. You don't have to protect me from it." So Naomi told her. Not the legal summary. She'd given Maya that over the phone in pieces. But the actual experience of it. The 11 years. The dinner party where Roy had explained the restructuring. The box of old files in the archive. The decision to copy them without knowing entirely why. The years of carrying it. The divorce signing and Adrian's smirk, and the moment she'd said what she said and he'd laughed. The 14 months of building the case while also building a company, while also being monitored by people who wanted her to go away. The night she'd worked until 6 in the morning organizing documents. The January cold outside the private club, when she and Claudia had stood on the sidewalk and worked out that the timeline had collapsed. the wire confirmation in the conference room, and the champagne that nobody could properly celebrate. Maya listened without interrupting, which was one of Maya's actual gifts. She could hold a long story without needing to reshape it into something more manageable. When Naomi finished, Maya was quiet for a moment. "You did all of that by yourself," she said. "I had Claudia," Naomi said, "and James, and David Lim, and Diane Stokes, and a reporter who was willing to look at what I had." "You know what I mean," Maya said. Naomi looked at her wine. "Yeah, I know what you mean." "How did you know you could?" Maya asked. "How did you know you had it in you to do something that big, for that long, with that many people trying to stop you?" Naomi thought about this seriously, because it was a serious question, and Maya deserved a real answer. She thought about the photograph, about the version of herself at 31 who had not yet become the version she became inside the marriage. The person who got quieter and smaller and more useful in a contained way and stopped taking up space in rooms because taking up space seemed to create friction. "I don't think I knew," she said finally. "I think I knew I didn't have a better option, which isn't the same thing as knowing you can do it. It's more like knowing you can't afford to fail is a kind of fuel. It's not courage exactly. It's more like the absence of an alternative." Maya was quiet. "The courage part," Naomi said, "if there was a courage part, was probably the 4 years before the divorce, when I knew what I knew and I carried it, and I didn't do anything with it because I was still trying to figure out if the marriage could be something other than what it had become. That was the part that cost me the most. Not the fight. The waiting." "Do you regret it? The waiting?" "Sometimes," Naomi said. "And sometimes I think I needed that time to become the person who could actually do what came after. I don't know which one is true, probably both." Maya reached across the table and put her hand over Naomi's. She didn't say anything, she just left it there. They sat like that for a while, two sisters at a kitchen table in Chicago, while the house was quiet around them, and the lake was somewhere in the dark beyond the neighborhood, and the world was doing what it always did. Continuing, indifferent, enormous, without particular regard for anything that had just been concluded. Well, the company Naomi had been building quietly for the past year had a name by May, Lattice Systems. It was not a name she'd labored over. It had come to her during a walk one morning, and she'd written it down and looked at it the next day, and it had still seemed right. Lattice, an interlocking structure, something that distributed weight evenly, something that held. The venture firm that had reached out to her in the fall had formalized a partnership agreement in March, after the Nexus sale closed and Naomi's financial position was established beyond any ambiguity. The agreement valued Lattice at pre-revenue and gave her full operational control. She had been specific about that. She had not built something real by herself for 14 months in order to hand control of it to someone else. David Lim was her head of engineering. She had hired 2 additional senior developers by April, both of them people she had identified carefully over several months. People who had left larger companies for reasons that said something about their values, not just their ambition. She had a small sales operation, a general counsel who had been a referral from James Cho, and a head of business development who had spent 12 years at a global freight company and understood the industry from the inside. 7 people total. Working out of a sublet office in the Flatiron district that was slightly too small and had a view of nothing in particular and smelled faintly of the previous tenant's coffee. The kind of office that belonged to something that was beginning rather than something that had arrived. She went there every morning and she worked and she argued with David about technical architecture and she called potential clients and she wrote the company's first operations manual herself, which everyone on the team told her was not a good use of a founder's time. And she did it anyway because she needed to understand every layer of what she was building before she trusted anyone else to build on top of it. It was not easy. It was often frustrating. There were days when 3 things went wrong before 10 in the morning, and she sat in the slightly too small office and thought about the $640 million in an account with her name on it, and the fact that she could stop right now and live comfortably for the rest of her life and never deal with a difficult vendor call or a missed deadline or a junior developer who had introduced a bug into the routing module at 11 p.m. on a Friday. She could stop. She didn't stop. She had understood something, sometime during the past year, about why she kept building even when she didn't have to. It wasn't about the money, and it wasn't about proving something. She had already proven whatever needed proving, at least to herself, and public proof was other people's business. It was something more basic. She was good at this. She was genuinely, specifically good at understanding complex systems and the people who ran them and the points where the two things met and created either efficiency or failure. She had been good at it at 31, standing in front of a server rack. She had been good at it inside a marriage where the skill was invisible. She had been good at it during 14 months of a corporate war that most people hadn't known was happening until it was over. Being good at something, she had decided, was not a small thing. It was not glamorous or transcendent. It was just accurate, just real. She was good at this, and she had spent too many years not doing it. That, more than anything, was what she was correcting now. In June, Carter Webb published a longer piece, a feature, not a news story, that described the Nexus dispute and the criminal proceedings in full detail. He had spent 3 months reporting it. It was 6,000 words, carefully sourced, and it named Naomi by name in a way that the earlier pieces had not. He had contacted her for comment before publication. She had agreed to one phone call, 30 minutes, on the record. "What do you want people to take from this?" he'd asked, near the end of the call. It was the kind of question that could have been soft and wasn't. He'd asked it with the directness of someone who actually wanted to know, not someone who wanted a quotable conclusion. She had thought about it for a moment. "I don't want people to take a lesson from it," she said. "It's not a parable. It's just something that happened to a specific person in specific circumstances." "Okay," he said. "But if you had to." She was quiet for a beat. "I'd say the thing that made the difference wasn't intelligence. I know people who are smarter than I am, who have been in situations like mine and didn't get out intact. It wasn't courage, because courage is the thing other people see from the outside, and from the inside it mostly just felt like not stopping." She paused. "The thing that made the difference was documentation. I documented everything, every conversation, every date, every file, every decision I made, and why I made it. That's not exciting. It's tedious. But it meant that at every point where someone tried to rewrite what had happened, I had a record of what had actually happened." "Documentation," Webb repeated, writing it down. "And one other thing," she said. "What's that?" "I stopped trying to be underestimated," she said. "For a long time, but not just in the marriage, before it too probably. I'd gotten into the habit of being less visible than I was. It felt safer. It avoided conflict. But it also meant that I was spending a significant amount of energy making myself smaller, and that energy wasn't available for anything else." She paused. "When I stopped doing that, when I just operated at the level I was actually capable of, things got harder in the short term and significantly better in the long term." The piece published on a Tuesday. It was widely read. She received emails through Claudia's office from people she had never met. Some professional inquiries, some personal messages, a few that were clearly from people who had found the story resonant in ways that had nothing to do with logistics technology. She read the personal messages carefully and responded to some of them. One was from a woman she didn't know, somewhere in the Midwest, who had written, "I've been in a situation where someone took something from me and I didn't know how to fight back because they had more power than I did. Your story made me think maybe there are ways to fight that don't require having the same kind of power they have." Naomi sat with that message for a long time. Then she wrote back, "You're right. There are. It requires patience and documentation and a willingness to take the long way around. It's not fast and it's not clean and you'll be tired for most of it, but it's real." She didn't know if that was useful. She sent it anyway. The Greenwich House sold in July. Adrian's assets had been largely frozen pending the resolution of the criminal proceedings and the associated civil suits, and the sale was handled by federal appointed administrators as part of the asset disposition process. The house sold for significantly less than its appraised value, which is what happens when assets are sold under legal compulsion rather than on a willing seller timeline. Naomi did not follow the sale closely. She had not been in that house in over a year and a half. It had stopped being home the way things stop being home. Not dramatically, not in a single moment, but gradually, the warmth leaching out of it until what was left was just a structure you move through. She drove past it once, in July, not for any reason she could justify cleanly, just, She was in Connecticut for a meeting with a potential client based in Greenwich, and the house was 3 miles from the meeting, and she found herself turning down the familiar road without making a decision about it. She drove past slowly, didn't stop. The house looked the same from the outside. The hydrangeas along the front walk were blooming, which they did every July regardless of who owned the house or what was happening inside it. She drove on, found the highway, went back to the city. In August, she took a weekend alone. Not Chicago, not a purpose. She drove north along the Hudson and found a small inn near a town she hadn't been to before, and checked in and walked for 2 days along the river and ate at the only restaurant in the town that was still open after 9, and read a novel she'd bought at a gas station and didn't think about lattice systems or Nexus or any of it, or tried not to, and partially succeeded, which was about what she'd expected. On the second evening, she sat on a bench by the river and watched the light go off the water in the way it does at the end of summer in the Northeast, warm and angled and slightly mournful, the light of something that knows it's temporary. She thought about the past 2 years. She thought about who she'd been at the beginning of them and who she was now, and the distance between the two, and whether that distance had been worth what it cost. It had cost her. She was not going to pretend it hadn't. The 14 months had been exhausting in ways she was still recovering from, not just physically, but in some harder-to-name way, the way that sustained high-stakes effort leaves a residue that doesn't clear quickly. She was sleeping better. She was eating better. She was present in her own life in a way she hadn't been for years. But there were still mornings when she woke at 4 a.m. with the particular alertness of a person who had trained herself to be vigilant for too long, and the vigilance didn't know it was no longer needed. That would pass. She believed that, not as a comfort, but as an assessment. What she was left with was this. She had found out what she was made of under conditions that were not hypothetical. That was not something she had known before. She had suspected the way you suspect things about yourself in the absence of evidence. But suspicion is a different thing from knowledge. She knew now. It was a strange possession, useful and heavy at the same time, the knowledge that you are capable of more than you previously understood, because it also means that more will be asked of you, by yourself, if not by anyone else. She thought about the women who had written to her after the Carter Webb piece, not just the one from the Midwest, but several others, different situations, different stakes, all of them circling the same question: how do you fight from a position of less power? She thought about what she'd learned that was actually transferable and what was specific to her circumstances and her skills and the particular shape of the situation she'd been in. She was not a formula. She was one person who had managed one specific set of conditions with one specific set of tools. She knew that. But she also thought that there was something underneath the specifics that was real and transferable, something she'd tried to gesture at with Webb and hadn't quite gotten to. It was this: the assumption that the powerful are protected by their power is only partially true. They are also constrained by it. Adrian had been so accustomed to winning by overwhelming force, money, lawyers, social capital, that he had no practice fighting patiently. He had no practice building something quietly over years. He had no practice being underestimated and using the underestimation. He had given her Constellation Holdings because it looked worthless. He had done that because his understanding of value was limited to what he could see. She had understood Nexus because she had spent years learning to understand systems, their architecture, their dependencies, the points where value was actually generated versus where it appeared to be generated. That understanding had not come from formal education or professional experience. It had come from years of being the person in the room who was not supposed to understand things at a technical level, but who had listened anyway, had asked questions anyway, had taught herself anyway, in the margins of a life that was not supposed to be about her professional competence. She had built her weapon out of what they had dismissed. That, she thought, was the thing. Not a strategy that generalized neatly, not a lesson you could write on a wall, but a truth that was specific enough to be real. The things people dismiss in you are sometimes the things that can undo them. Not always. Not in every situation, but more often than the people doing the dismissing would ever believe. The light was fully gone off the water now. The river was dark and moving. She sat for a while longer, not thinking anything in particular, just being present in the end of summer in a town she didn't know, alive and intact and entirely her own. Then she drove back to the inn, slept well, and went home to New York in the morning. Home. Lattice Systems signed its first paying client in September, a mid-size freight broker based in Atlanta that had been referred by the venture firm. It was not a large contract. It was a beginning. Naomi was in the Flatiron office when the contract was signed. David ordered food from the Thai place around the corner. They sat on the office floor, 7 people, eating from containers, arguing about the deployment timeline and whether the Atlanta integration was going to surface the bug David had been tracking in the routing module for 3 weeks. It was not glamorous. It smelled like pad thai and overworked air conditioning and the slightly stale carpet of a sublet that had not been redecorated since 2019. She looked around at the 7 people arguing about the routing bug and the deployment timeline and the follow-up call with the Atlanta client, and she felt something she didn't have a precise word for. Something that was not triumph and not contentment exactly, but was close to what she'd described to Webb as not stopping. The ongoing quality of building, the feeling of something alive in your hands. This was what she had been working toward, underneath everything. Not the money, though the money mattered, and she was not going to be falsely modest about that. Not the vindication, though there had been vindication and she had felt it. But this, a room with people she had chosen, doing work she understood, on something she was building with her own decisions and her own name. She was not done. Lattice had months of difficult work ahead, and some of that work would fail and have to be rebuilt, and there would be client problems and team problems and the ordinary grinding difficulty of creating something from nothing. She knew this. She was not done. That was the point. She picked up her container of pad thai and rejoined the argument about the routing bug. And the evening went on in the way evenings go on when something real is happening, imperfectly, with voices overlapping and someone spilling green tea on the deployment notes, and the city doing its late September thing outside the window. And for the first time in as long as she could accurately remember, she was not braced for anything. She was just here. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything.